The galaxy shattered in the closing years of the 41st millennium. What began on Cadia with Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade culminated in a catastrophe that would reshape the Imperium forever. When the ancient pylons of Cadia, those mysterious structures that had held back the tides of the warp since before the rise of humanity, were finally destroyed, the consequences exceeded even the Despoiler's expectations. The planet broke before the guard did, as the saying goes, but the breaking of Cadia unleashed something far worse than any military defeat. The Cicatrix Maledictum tore across the galaxy like a wound that would never heal. This massive warp rift, stretching from the Eye of Terror to the Haydex anomaly on the eastern fringe, split the Imperium into two distinct regions. The astronomers and strategists of Terra designated these zones Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, the Imperium of Light and the Imperium of Darkness. The Great Rift wasn't simply a navigational hazard or a region of unstable space. It was a literal tear in reality itself, a place where the materium and the immaterium bled into one another with horrifying consequences. The rift manifested as a roiling scar of impossible colors and shapes that defied human perception. Voidship crews who looked upon it reported madness, bleeding eyes, and spontaneous mutations among their ranks. The thing pulsed with malevolent energy, spawning smaller warp storms along its length like a diseased artery spawning blood clots. Worlds that found themselves within the rift's boundaries simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, their populations transformed into gibbering cultists or torn apart by demonic entities that now walked freely in real space. The immediate aftermath brought the Noctis Aeterna, the period of blackness that would be remembered as one of the darkest times in Imperial history. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy with unprecedented fury, isolating star systems and entire sectors from one another. The carefully maintained network of astropathic communication that held the Imperium together simply stopped functioning. Astropaths attempting to send messages through the warp found their minds consumed by the psychic turbulence, their bodies reduced to withered husks as their souls were devoured by entities lurking in the immaterium. The temporal anomalies proved particularly devastating. The warp had always been a place where time held little meaning, but now those inconsistencies bled into real space on a massive scale. On some worlds, the Noctis Aeterna lasted mere weeks. The populations of these fortunate planets endured a period of darkness and isolation before the storms abated and contact was restored. Other worlds were not so lucky. Entire generations lived and died during what was, from an external perspective, only months. Planets that had been loyal bastions of the Imperium for millennia descended into barbarism or civil war as centuries of isolation transformed their cultures beyond recognition. Some worlds experienced the opposite effect. Only days passed for their inhabitants while decades elapsed in the wider galaxy, leaving them confused and disoriented when contact was finally reestablished. The Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon maintained by the Emperor's will, and the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily, flickered and dimmed across vast stretches of space. For the regions that would become Imperium Nihilus, the light of the Astronomicon vanished entirely. Navigator houses found their members unable to chart safe courses through the warp. Ships that attempted to make the jump to warp space either vanished without trace or emerged thousands of light years off course, sometimes centuries late. The carefully plotted warp routes that had connected the Imperium for 10,000 years became death traps. Entire battle fleets disappeared, their fates unknown. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The Imperium had always been a fragile entity, held together by the Administratum's bureaucracy, the Imperial Navy's ability to move forces between threatened sectors, and the Astra Militarum's capacity to reinforce war zones with fresh troops. All of this depended on warp travel and astropathic communication. Without these tools, the Imperium fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance. Forge worlds that had supplied entire sectors with weapons and equipment found themselves cut off from their customers. Hive worlds that imported food from agri-worlds faced starvation as supply ships failed to arrive. Military commanders discovered they were fighting wars with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. The demonic incursions that followed the Great Rift's birth made everything worse. The barrier between real space and the warp had always been thin in certain locations, near warp storms, on demon worlds, or in places where great atrocities had been committed. Now that barrier had been shredded across the entire galaxy. Demons poured through into reality, manifesting without the need for elaborate rituals or mass sacrifices. Bloodletters of Khorne materialized in the middle of battlefields, their hellblades cutting through Imperial guardsmen before anyone realized what was happening. Plaguebearers shuffled through hab blocks, spreading Nurgle's gifts to terrified civilians. Pink horrors cackled as they unleashed warpfire on PDF troopers who had never expected to face such enemies. The psychological impact on Imperial forces proved almost as destructive as the physical threat. The Imperium's propaganda had always maintained that the Emperor protected the faithful, that loyalty and devotion would be rewarded with salvation. The Noctis Aeterna shattered that comfortable lie. Entire regiments of Imperial Guard found themselves abandoned on hostile worlds, watching the sky for rescue that would never come. Space Marine chapters discovered their home worlds had been consumed by warp storms, their recruiting populations lost forever. Planetary governors who had served the Imperium faithfully for their entire lives watched their worlds descend into anarchy as food ran out and order collapsed. The responses across the galaxy varied wildly based on local circumstances and the character of those in command. Some worlds fell to chaos corruption with shocking speed. Populations that had seemed loyal for generations revealed themselves to have been infiltrated by chaos cults who seized the opportunity provided by the Noctis Aeterna to overthrow Imperial rule. These uprisings followed predictable patterns. The cultists would sabotage communications and power infrastructure, assassinate key officials, and then emerge from hiding to slaughter anyone who resisted. Within weeks, worlds that had tithed faithfully to Terra for millennia became nightmare realms where demon princes ruled from the ruins of imperial palaces. Other worlds mounted desperate last stands that would be remembered in imperial records for generations. On Mordian, the Iron Guard held their lines against endless waves of chaos cultists and demons, their discipline never breaking despite being cut off from all outside contact for months. The Cadian survivors who had escaped their world's destruction brought news of the catastrophe to other systems, rallying defenders who might otherwise have surrendered. On Armageddon, Commissar Yarrick organized the defense of the Hive cities against a fresh Orc invasion, knowing that no reinforcements would arrive, but refusing to yield a single meter of ground. The Space Marine chapters found themselves in particularly difficult circumstances. Their small numbers meant they relied on mobility and the ability to respond rapidly to threats across multiple sectors. With warp travel unreliable or impossible, chapters found themselves trapped in single systems, unable to reach battle brothers who might be fighting desperate actions only a few light years away. Some chapters adapted by fortifying key worlds and preparing for extended sieges. Others continued attempting warp jumps despite the risks, accepting catastrophic losses in order to maintain their operational flexibility. The Black Templars, already organized into scattered Crusade fleets, found their disposition well suited to the new reality, with each marshal commanding an independent force capable of operating without central coordination. The Adeptus Mechanicus faced unique challenges during the Noctis Aeterna. Their forge worlds were typically heavily fortified and well defended, but many relied on imports of raw materials from mining worlds that were now unreachable. Tech priests who had spent centuries perfecting their understanding of specific technologies found themselves forced to improvise and adapt, a concept that went against their fundamental beliefs. Some forge worlds responded by becoming even more insular and defensive, hoarding their remaining resources and refusing all contact with outsiders. Others recognized the necessity of cooperation and formed local alliances with nearby imperial worlds, trading technology for food and manpower. The Ecclesiarchy's response combined genuine faith with calculated propaganda. Preachers declared that the Noctis Aeterna was a test of the faithful, a trial sent by the Emperor to separate the truly devoted from the weak. This message resonated on some worlds, inspiring populations to endure hardships that might otherwise have broken their morale. On other worlds, the obvious falsehood of such claims, how could a loving emperor inflict such suffering on his faithful servants? drove populations toward heresy or despair. Fraterist militia forces found themselves in constant combat against cultist uprisings and demonic incursions, their faith tested by enemies that defied everything they had been taught about the nature of reality. The Inquisition's various ordos scrambled to respond to threats that exceeded their worst predictions. The Ordo Malleus found itself overwhelmed by the sheer scale of demonic activity, with individual inquisitors forced to prioritize which incursions to combat and which to abandon. The Ordo Hereticus discovered that chaos corruption had spread far deeper into imperial society than anyone had suspected, with entire planetary governments revealed as fronts for demonic cults. The Ordo Xenos faced the additional complication that alien races were also taking advantage of imperial weakness, launching invasions and raids that would have been impossible when imperial forces could respond effectively. The Great Rift's impact on Imperium Nihilus was particularly severe. Cut off from Terra and the light of the Astronomicon, these regions faced the full fury of chaos without hope of significant reinforcement. Some sectors managed to maintain coherent defensive lines through local cooperation and the leadership of capable commanders. Others fragmented completely, degenerating into isolated fortress worlds surrounded by hostile territory. The distinction between Imperium Nihilus and the regions consumed entirely by chaos became increasingly blurred as decades passed and no relief arrived. While the Imperium burned and the Noctis Aeterna plunged countless worlds into isolation and despair, salvation stirred in the most unlikely of places. On Ma Crag, the jewel of Ultramar and home world of the Ultramarines chapter, something impossible was about to occur, something that would have been dismissed as heretical fantasy by any rational servant of the Imperium. Within the Temple of Correction, in the Shrine of Guilliman itself, the body of Roboute Guilliman had remained in stasis for 10,000 years, neither alive nor truly dead, preserved in a moment of agony that had lasted since the Horus Heresy. The wound that had brought down the Lord of Ultramar came from the hand of his own brother. During the Battle of Thessala, Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's Children Legion, already transformed into a demon prince in service to Slaanesh, had struck Guilliman down with a blade poisoned by the powers of chaos. The weapon had not simply injured the Primarch's flesh, it had infected him with an essence of the warp itself, a corruption that prevented his enhanced biology from healing. Guilliman's sons had found him dying on that battlefield, his throat cut and his body racked with the poison's effects. In desperation, the Ultramarines had placed their gene father in a stasis field, freezing him at the moment before death could claim him completely. For 10 millennia, Guilliman had remained in that state. The stasis field preserved him perfectly, his armor still bearing the marks of Fulgrim's attack, his face locked in an expression that combined pain with grim determination. The Shrine of Guilliman became a place of pilgrimage for the Ultramarines and the citizens of Ultramar. They came to look upon their fallen lord, to pray before his frozen form, to draw inspiration from his example. The chapter maintained an honor guard around the shrine at all times, and the Ultramarines who served in that capacity considered it among the highest duties they could perform. Yet despite the prayers of billions and the hopes of countless generations of Space Marines, Guilliman remained trapped in his moment of near death, unreachable and unchanging. The Imperium that had grown up around Guilliman's frozen form bore little resemblance to the one he had helped build. The imperial truth, the secular philosophy that had rejected religion and superstition in favor of reason and science, had been completely abandoned. In its place, the ecclesiarchy preached the divinity of the emperor, transforming the master of mankind into a god who demanded worship and sacrifice. The Codex Astartes, Guilliman's masterwork of military organization and strategic doctrine, had been elevated to the status of holy scripture rather than the practical military manual he had intended. The Administratum had grown into a bureaucratic nightmare that would have horrified the Primarch, who had once reorganized the Imperium's administrative systems with ruthless efficiency. The possibility of Guilliman's resurrection came from an alliance that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Archmagos Belisarius Call of the Adeptus Mechanicus had spent millennia working on technologies that pushed the boundaries of what the Imperium considered acceptable. His research into the Primaris Space Marine project, conducted in secret on the orders Guilliman himself had given him 10,000 years earlier, had given him insights into Primarch biology that no other tech priest possessed. Call understood that Guilliman's body remained viable despite the chaos corruption, that the stasis field had prevented the poison from completing its work. But he also knew that no technology of the Imperium could purge that corruption. The warp taint that kept Guilliman trapped required a power that matched its nature. That power arrived with Ivrain, emissary of Ennead and leader of the Inari. The Eldari faction known as the Inari followed a new god, or rather, a god struggling to be born. Ennead, the Eldari god of the dead, represented a potential salvation for the Eldari race, a deity that might shield them from the predations of Slaanesh, the chaos god who had been born from their civilization's fall and who still hunted their souls. Ivrain wielded the crone sword Ka-Vir, one of several artifacts empowered by Ennead's nascent essence. The crone swords possessed the ability to manipulate life and death in ways that transcended normal understanding, drawing on the power of an Eldari god to achieve what would otherwise be impossible. The alliance between Khal and Ivrain emerged from mutual necessity rather than trust. The Inari needed human allies in their struggle against chaos, particularly against the forces of Slaanesh who sought to prevent Ennead's awakening. Khal recognized that the resurrection of a Primarch could provide the Imperium with the leadership it desperately needed to survive the crisis of the Great Rift. The Archmagos had maintained contact with various Eldari factions throughout his long existence, a fact that would have seen him executed for heresy if it had become widely known. When Ivrain approached him with the possibility of using the crone sword's power to heal Guilliman, Khal saw an opportunity that might never come again. The practical obstacles to the resurrection were immense. The Ultramarines chapter would never willingly allow xenos to approach their Primarch's body, regardless of the promised outcome. The Adeptus Custodes maintained a presence on Muck Crag, and they would view any attempt to tamper with Guilliman's stasis field as potential heresy. The political complications alone should have made the attempt impossible, but the Great Rift's opening and the Noctis Aeterna created a window of opportunity. Communication with Terra had been severed, meaning that Khal could act without immediate oversight from the Mechanicus hierarchy. The Ultramarines themselves were engaged in desperate battles across Ultramar as chaos forces poured through the weakened barrier between real space and the warp. Khal convinced Chapter Master Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines that the attempt was worth the risk. The Archmagos presented evidence of his 10,000-year project to create the Primaris Space Marines, proving that he had been working on Guilliman's direct orders all along. He demonstrated that the stasis field could not maintain Guilliman indefinitely. The chaos corruption was slowly spreading despite the temporal freeze, and within a few more centuries, the Primarch would be beyond any hope of recovery. Most importantly, he argued that the Imperium faced an existential crisis that required Guilliman's strategic genius and leadership. Calgar, facing the reality of Ultramar's desperate situation and the apparent abandonment by Terra, made the decision to permit the attempt. The resurrection itself combined Khal's technological expertise with the psychic power channeled through Ivrain's crone sword. The Archmagos had spent millennia studying the stasis field and the nature of the corruption that held Guilliman trapped. He understood the precise moment at which the field would need to be deactivated, the exact application of his medical technologies that would be required to support the Primarch's biology as it attempted to heal. Ivrain's role was to use the crone sword's power to burn away the chaos taint, to purge the warp poison that had prevented Guilliman's enhanced physiology from repairing the damage Fulgrim had inflicted. When the stasis field finally deactivated, Guilliman's body began to die immediately. The wound in his throat reopened, the poison surged through his system, and for a moment it appeared that the Primarch would simply expire after his 10,000-year suspension. Then Ivrain struck, driving the crone sword into Guilliman's chest. The blade's power flooded through the Primarch's body, and those present reported seeing a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal reality. The chaos corruption burned away, consumed by the power of an Eldari god of death. Guilliman's enhanced biology, finally freed from the warp taint that had paralyzed it, began the process of healing. The wound in his throat closed, his hearts resumed their rhythm, and his eyes opened for the first time in 10,000 years. The Primarch's first moments of consciousness were disorienting and painful. His last clear memory was of Fulgrim's attack, of the Horus heresy still raging across the galaxy, of an Imperium that was fighting for survival but still held true to the Imperial truth. The faces that greeted him, Marneus Calgar in his armor of Heracles Belisarius Call with his heavily augmented form, and the Eldari witch Ivrain, made no sense in the context of what Guilliman remembered. The Primarch's first questions concerned the status of the heresy, the locations of his brother Primarchs, and the situation on Terra. The answers he received began the process of disillusionment that would define his response to the Imperium he had awakened into. Guilliman learned that the Horus heresy had ended 10,000 years ago. His brothers were dead, transformed into demon princes, or missing. The Emperor sat immobile on the Golden Throne, sustained by the sacrifice of thousands of Psykers daily, unable to communicate except through the most cryptic and indirect means. The Imperium had not progressed or improved in the intervening millennia. It had stagnated and regressed, transforming into a theocratic nightmare that worshipped his father as a god. The citizens of this new Imperium lived in squalor and ignorance, their lives consumed by endless toil and meaningless ritual. The Space Marine legions had been broken into chapters, a reform Guilliman himself had implemented, but the Codex Astartes he had written as a practical military manual had become a sacred text that some chapters followed with religious fervor. The horror and disillusionment Guilliman experienced went beyond simple shock at the passage of time. He had fought in the Great Crusade believing that humanity could build a better future, that reason and science could triumph over superstition and ignorance. He had helped his father craft an Imperium based on the imperial truth, rejecting the worship of gods and the submission to religious authority. Now he discovered that his father was worshipped as a god by trillions of faithful across the galaxy, that the ecclesiarchy wielded immense political power, and that the Adeptus Mechanicus treated technology as religious mystery rather than pursuing scientific understanding. The Imperium he had bled for, the dream he had nearly died to defend, had been corrupted into something he barely recognized. The immediate tactical situation demanded action regardless of Guilliman's personal feelings. Ultramar faced invasion by Chaos forces taking advantage of the Great Rift's opening. The Plague Wars had begun, with Mortarion, the demon Primarch of the Death Guard, and Guilliman's traitorous brother, leading a massive invasion of the realm. Communication with Terra remained impossible due to the warp storms of the Noctis Aeterna. Guilliman made the decision to launch what would become known as the Terran Crusade, a massive military operation aimed at fighting through the Maelstrom region and reaching Holy Terra itself. The Primarch took command of a fleet that combined Ultramarines forces with elements from other chapters, Imperial Navy vessels, and contingents of the Astra Militarum. Call accompanied the crusade with his Primaris Space Marines, finally revealing the results of his 10,000-year project. These enhanced Space Marines stood taller than their standard brethren, possessed superior equipment, and had been created using improved versions of the gene seed implantation process. Their introduction created immediate tensions. Many Space Marines viewed them with suspicion, seeing them as a challenge to their own status and traditions. But Guilliman had no patience for such concerns. The Imperium faced existential threats, and he would use every weapon at his disposal to ensure its survival. The fighting through the Maelstrom region tested even the Primarch's strategic genius. The warp storms made navigation nearly impossible, and Chaos forces ambushed the Crusade fleet repeatedly. Guilliman demonstrated that his military capabilities had not diminished during his long stasis. He coordinated fleet actions with ground operations, personally led boarding actions against Chaos vessels, and made tactical decisions with the speed and precision that had made him one of the Emperor's most valued sons during the Great Crusade. The Space Marines who fought alongside him reported that the Primarch seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, his presence inspiring them to feats of valor they had not thought possible. When Guilliman finally reached Terra and stood before the Golden Throne, the full weight of the Imperium's decay became undeniable. The Emperor, the being Guilliman had known as his father, the visionary who had united humanity and launched the Great Crusade, was a withered corpse held in an eternal moment of near death by the Golden Throne's machinery. The master of mankind could not speak, could not move, could barely be said to be alive in any meaningful sense. Yet the psychic power radiating from the Golden Throne was immense, a burning presence that kept the astronomic in functioning and held back the demonic forces that constantly sought to breach Terra's defenses. Guilliman understood in that moment that the emperor he had known was gone, replaced by something that might be a god, but was certainly no longer human. The being on the Golden Throne acknowledged the Primarch's presence, and in that brief moment of psychic contact, Guilliman received impressions and commands that he would spend years attempting to interpret and understand. The audience with the Emperor left Guilliman shaken but resolute. Whatever his personal feelings about the Imperium's transformation into a theocratic nightmare, the strategic situation demanded immediate action. Terra had survived the opening of the Great Rift, but the Imperium remained fractured and bleeding. Worlds across both Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus faced extinction at the hands of chaos cultists, demon incursions, and xenos invasions. The Administratum's reports, those that had managed to reach Terra through the disrupted astropathic network, painted a picture of catastrophic losses. Entire sectors had gone dark, their fates unknown. The Primarch recognized that without coordinated intervention, the Imperium would collapse into isolated fortress worlds surrounded by hostile territory. Guilliman's first major decision concerned the revelation that Archmago's Belisarius Call had brought with him from Mars. The Primaris Space Marine project represented a fundamental shift in the Imperium's military capabilities, and the Primarch understood that its implementation would generate resistance from traditionalists within the Adeptus Astartes. Call had spent 10,000 years perfecting the process, working from instructions Guilliman himself had provided in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. The Archmagos had operated in secret, maintaining hidden facilities across multiple forge worlds, conducting research that pushed the boundaries of what the Mechanicus considered acceptable. The scale of the project was staggering. Millions of Primaris Marines held in stasis, waiting for the day when they would be needed. The enhanced physiology of the Primaris Marines went beyond simple improvements to existing implants. Call had developed 3 entirely new organs that would be implanted alongside the traditional 19-gene seed organs. The sinew coils were threaded throughout the Marines' musculature, enhancing physical strength beyond what standard Space Marines could achieve. These biomechanical augmentations allowed Primaris Marines to wear heavier armor and wield weapons that would have been impractical for their predecessors. The Magnificat represented a more controversial development, a secondary heart-like organ that enhanced the function of all other implants, pushing the Marines' capabilities to levels that approached what Guilliman remembered of the Space Marines from the Great Crusade era. The Belisarian furnace served as a fail-safe system, flooding the Marine's body with combat stims and healing factors when he suffered catastrophic injury, keeping him fighting even when wounds that would incapacitate a standard Marine. The practical advantages of Primaris Marines extended beyond their enhanced biology. Call had developed new patterns of weapons and armor specifically designed for their increased size and strength. The Mark X power armor incorporated design elements that had been lost since the Horus Heresy, combined with innovations that the Archmagos had developed during his millennia of research. The armor stood taller and bulkier than standard Mark VII or Mark VIII plate, with enhanced power systems that could support more sophisticated weapon systems. The bolt rifles that Primaris Marines carried fired rounds with greater range and penetrating power than standard bolt guns, addressing one of the traditional weaknesses of Space Marine infantry in long-range engagements. Guilliman recognized that the introduction of Primaris Marines would create tensions within existing chapters. Space Marines took immense pride in their heritage and traditions, and many would view the Primaris as a challenge to their legitimacy. The Primarch addressed this concern through a carefully structured integration plan. Existing chapters would receive reinforcements of Primaris Marines created from their own gene seed stock. These reinforcements would bolster chapter strength, allowing formations that had been reduced to a fraction of their nominal size to return to combat effectiveness. The Primaris Marines would serve alongside their standard brethren, learning chapter traditions and culture while contributing their enhanced capabilities to ongoing campaigns. The strategic reorganization that Guilliman ordered went deeper than simply adding new Marines to existing formations. Many chapters had developed command structures and tactical doctrines that deviated significantly from the Codex Astartes. The Primarch had no intention of forcing rigid conformity. He understood that flexibility and adaptation were essential to military effectiveness. However, he did insist on certain standardizations that would allow different chapters to coordinate their actions more effectively. Communication protocols needed to be compatible across different formations. Logistics and supply systems required standardization so that chapters could support each other during extended campaigns. The command structure needed to allow for unified strategic direction while preserving the operational independence that made Space Marine chapters effective. The Ultima founding represented the most ambitious expansion of the Adeptus Astartes since the second founding that had followed the Horus Heresy. Guilliman authorized the creation of hundreds of new chapters, all composed entirely of Primaris Marines. These formations would be built from the ground up according to Codex principles, without the accumulated traditions and idiosyncrasies that characterized older chapters. The gene seed for these new chapters came from all 9 loyal Primarchs, including genetic lineages that had been considered too unstable for widespread use in previous foundings. Call claimed his improvements to the gene seed implantation process had eliminated the genetic flaws that had plagued certain bloodlines, though many within the Adeptus Astartes remained skeptical of this assertion. The organization of the Crusade fleets required coordination across multiple war zones and the assembly of resources on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade itself. Guilliman established Ultramar as the primary staging area, using the realm's industrial capacity and naval facilities to prepare the massive fleets that would carry the Crusade across the galaxy. The Primarch's own experience in logistics and military organization proved essential. He understood the complex calculations required to maintain supply lines across interstellar distances, the importance of establishing forward bases and resupply points, and the need for redundancy in command structures when warp travel remained unpredictable. The Primaris Marines designated for the Crusade remained in stasis until their deployment, held in specialized vaults aboard massive transport vessels. Call had organized them into formations called Grey Shields, Marines who wore unpainted armor and bore no chapter markings, waiting to be assigned to their permanent formations. The Grey Shields represented a resource pool that Guilliman could draw upon as the Crusade progressed, reinforcing formations that took heavy casualties or creating new task forces to address emerging threats. The organization reflected the Primarch's practical approach to military operations. He valued flexibility and the ability to respond to changing circumstances over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. The assembly of Crusade fleets across Imperium Sanctus proceeded despite the disruptions caused by ongoing warp storms. Naval officers who had spent their entire careers managing relatively small squadrons found themselves coordinating armadas that numbered in the hundreds of vessels. The Imperial Navy contributed battleships, cruisers, and escort vessels from fleets across multiple sectors. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided forged ships and transport vessels, along with the technical expertise required to maintain the advanced equipment that the Primaris Marines would deploy. The Astra Militarum committed millions of soldiers organized into regiment-sized formations, understanding that the Crusade would require conventional military forces to hold ground that Space Marines seized. Guilliman's strategic objectives for the Indomitus Crusade reflected his assessment of the Imperium's most critical vulnerabilities. The immediate priority was stabilizing Imperium Sanctus, the region that remained connected to Terra and the light of the Astronomicon. Thousands of worlds within this territory faced active threats from Chaos forces, xenos invasions, or internal rebellion. The Crusade would need to relieve besieged planets, eliminate major enemy concentrations, and re-establish Imperial control over regions that had descended into anarchy during the Noctis Aeterna. The Primarch understood that this would be a grinding campaign of attrition, with Crusade fleets moving from one war zone to the next, never able to fully eliminate all threats, but working to reduce them to manageable levels. The establishment of the Nachmund Gauntlet represented a more ambitious objective. This corridor through the Great Rift would provide a navigable route between Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, allowing communication and reinforcement between the two halves of the divided Imperium. The strategic value of such a corridor was immense. It would transform Imperium Nihilus from an isolated region facing inevitable defeat into a viable theater of operations that could receive support from Terra. The Nachmund Gauntlet's establishment would require securing a chain of star systems along the corridor, fortifying them against chaos attacks, and maintaining a permanent military presence capable of keeping the route open against constant enemy pressure. The Crusade's organization reflected lessons Guilliman had learned during the Great Crusade, adapted to the current strategic situation. Rather than a single massive fleet that would move from target to target, the Indomitus Crusade would deploy multiple fleet groups operating semi-independently across different regions. Each fleet group would include Space Marine forces from multiple chapters, Imperial Navy vessels, Astra Militarum regiments, and Mechanicus support elements. This organization allowed the Crusade to engage threats across a broad front, preventing enemy forces from concentrating against a single axis of advance. The fleet groups maintained communication with each other when possible, coordinating their movements to create mutually supporting operations, but each possessed the capability to operate independently when warp storms disrupted coordination. The Primarch personally selected the commanders who would lead the major fleet groups. He looked for officers who demonstrated tactical flexibility, the ability to operate independently without constant direction from higher authority, and the willingness to cooperate with forces from other branches of the Imperial military. Space Marine chapter masters who had spent centuries fighting according to their own traditions found themselves required to coordinate their actions with Imperial Guard generals and naval admirals. The culture shock was significant, but Guilliman made clear that he would relieve any commander who allowed inter-service rivalry to compromise operational effectiveness. The weapons and equipment that Call provided to the Crusade included technologies that had not been seen in the Imperium for millennia. The Archmagos had rediscovered or reverse-engineered designs from the Dark Age of technology, combining them with his own innovations to create weapon systems that exceeded standard Imperial capabilities. The repulsor grav tanks that would transport Primaris Marines combined anti-gravity propulsion with heavy weapons loadouts, providing fire support and mobility that standard Rhino transports could not match. The Redemptor dreadnoughts incorporated more sophisticated weapon systems and power plants than the standard Castroferum pattern, though at the cost of placing greater strain on the entombed Marines' physiology. The launch of the Indomitus Crusade from Ultramar marked the beginning of what would become the largest military operation in Imperial history since the Great Crusade. Fleet groups departed for their assigned target zones, their warp jumps coordinated to bring them into real space at approximately the same time despite the unpredictability of warp travel. The scale of the operation was staggering. Millions of Space Marines, billions of Imperial Guardsmen, and thousands of warships all committed to a single strategic objective. Guilliman understood that the Crusade represented the Imperium's best chance to survive the crisis created by the Great Rift. Failure would mean the gradual collapse of Imperial authority across the galaxy, the transformation of humanity into scattered pocket empires surrounded by hostile forces. Success would not restore the Imperium to its former glory. The Primarch harbored no illusions about that, but it might preserve enough of the Imperial structure to allow humanity to endure. The Crusade fleets that departed from Ultramar dispersed across multiple vectors, each assigned to theaters where Imperial authority faced imminent collapse. Fleet Primus remained under Guilliman's personal command, and its destination surprised many of the officers who had expected the Primarch to lead the drive toward Terra or to focus on securing the Nachmund gauntlet. Instead, Guilliman turned his attention back to Ultramar itself. Intelligence reports filtering through the disrupted astropathic network painted a dire picture of the 500 worlds. Mortarion had emerged from the Scourge Stars, a cluster of demon worlds that the Death Guard had established in the wake of the Great Rift's opening, and launched a systematic invasion of the realm that Guilliman had spent 10,000 years building into a model of imperial governance. The strategic logic behind Mortarion's target selection was obvious to anyone who understood the history between the two Primarchs. During the Great Crusade, Guilliman and Mortarion had maintained a relationship characterized by mutual contempt barely concealed beneath formal courtesy. Mortarion viewed his brother as an arrogant administrator who had never truly understood the grim reality of warfare, someone who fought clean campaigns against enemies that could be defeated through superior logistics and organization. Guilliman saw Mortarion as a bitter fatalist whose pessimism infected everything he touched, a commander who ground down his enemies through attrition rather than pursuing elegant strategic solutions. The transformation of Mortarion into a demon Primarch in service to Nurgle had only amplified these characteristics. Now the Lord of Death commanded forces that embodied decay and entropy, spreading corruption that transformed entire worlds into extensions of the Plague God's garden. The Death Guard's invasion of Ultramar followed patterns that reflected both Mortarion's strategic preferences and Nurgle's nature. Rather than seeking rapid conquest through overwhelming force, the Death Guard established beachheads on target worlds and then systematically spread corruption outward from these infection points. The Plague Marines deployed biological weapons that made conventional Imperial defenses irrelevant. Entire hive cities found their populations succumbing to diseases that defied medical treatment, their bodies transforming into vectors for further infection. Agricultural worlds watched their crops wither and die, replaced by fungal growths that spread toxic spores across previously fertile soil. Ocean worlds saw their seas turn into stagnant pools of filth where nothing natural could survive. The fall of Ajax represented the most devastating blow to Ultramar's defensive capabilities. This garden world had served multiple critical functions within the realm's infrastructure. Its agricultural output fed billions across neighboring systems. More importantly, Ajax housed the primary gene seed repositories for the Ultramarines chapter and their successor chapters. The facilities on Ajax maintained genetic material from tens of thousands of Space Marines, stored in stasis vaults deep beneath the planet's surface. The loss of these repositories would cripple the chapter's ability to create new Marines, potentially for centuries. Mortarion understood this, and he made Ajax a priority target for the Death Guard's most concentrated assault. The defense of Ajax showcased both the courage of the Ultramarines and the horrifying effectiveness of the Death Guard's corruption. Chapter forces deployed to the planet's surface fought a grinding campaign against Plague Marines, who shrugged off wounds that would have killed normal Chaos Space Marines. The Death Guard advanced through storms of bolter fire, their corrupted armor absorbing hits that should have penetrated to vital organs. When Ultramarines engaged them in close combat, they discovered that even successful strikes often failed to stop their opponents. A Plague Marine with his chest cavity blown open would continue fighting, his enhanced physiology sustained by Nurgle's gifts even as his body fell apart. The diseases that the Death Guard carried proved even more dangerous than their weapons. Ultramarines who survived combat found themselves succumbing to infections days later, their enhanced immune systems overwhelmed by plagues that had been refined in Nurgle's gardens specifically to overcome Space Marine physiology. The corruption of Ajax proceeded according to patterns that would be repeated across dozens of worlds in Ultramar. The Death Guard established a central infection point around their landing zones, where the barrier between real space and the warp had been deliberately weakened through ritual and mass sacrifice. Demons of Nurgle poured through these breaches, plague-bearers shuffling in endless processions, great unclean ones whose bloated forms towered over the battlefield, Nurglings that swarmed across defensive positions in waves of diseased flesh. The planet's environment began transforming as the warp infection spread. Plants mutated into twisted versions of themselves, their leaves weeping toxic fluids. animals transformed into plague-bearing vectors that spread corruption faster than the Death Guard's advance. The very soil became contaminated, and Ultramarines reported that their armor's environmental seals struggled to filter out the toxins that permeated the atmosphere. The gene seed repositories on Ix fell despite desperate defense by the Ultramarines. The chapter threw everything they had into protecting the facilities, understanding that their loss would represent a strategic catastrophe. Terminators held choke points against waves of plague marines, their storm bolters cutting down enemies who kept advancing even as their bodies disintegrated under sustained fire. Dreadnoughts provided fire support, their assault cannons and las cannons destroying demon engines that the Death Guard deployed to break through fortified positions. But the sheer persistence of the Death Guard assault eventually overwhelmed the defenders. The Plague Marines didn't need to win quickly. They could afford to take casualties that would have broken any other attacking force, because Nurgle's power sustained them even in death. When the facilities finally fell, Mortarion personally oversaw the corruption of the gene seed stocks, transforming them into diseased mockeries that would spawn only abominations if implanted into aspirants. The transformation of conquered worlds into plague planets followed a consistent pattern across Ultramar. Once the Death Guard secured control of a world's major population centers, they would begin the process of fully integrating it into Nurgle's realm. Ritual sites were established where cultists conducted ceremonies that further weakened the barrier between real space and the warp. These sites became permanent infection points, places where demons could manifest without requiring the sustained effort that summoning normally demanded. The planet's biosphere underwent forced evolution, with native species either dying out or mutating into forms that thrived in the corrupted environment. Human populations that survived the initial invasion found themselves transformed by exposure to the omnipresent diseases. Some became poxwalkers, shambling undead that retained no trace of their former humanity. Others mutated into forms that served the Death Guard as auxiliary troops, their bodies twisted by Nurgle's gifts into weapons of biological warfare. The Scourge Stars represented the ultimate expression of what Mortarion intended for all of Ultramar. This cluster of systems near Ultramar's borders had been completely consumed by warp corruption, transformed into demon worlds where the laws of physics bent to accommodate Nurgle's preferences. The primary world of the Scourge Stars, which the Death Guard called the Plague Planet, served as Mortarion's base of operations. Reports from the few Imperial scouts who had observed the system and survived described a world that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, its surface covered in gardens of diseased vegetation that stretched to horizons that defied normal geometry. Fortresses built from corrupted metal and diseased flesh dotted the landscape, their architecture following patterns that hurt the eyes of observers. The Death Guard used the Scourge Stars as both a staging area for their invasions and as a factory for producing the biological weapons they deployed across Ultramar. The Battle of Parmenio demonstrated the tactical challenges that Imperial forces faced when engaging the Death Guard. This hive world had maintained its defenses through the initial waves of the invasion, its PDF forces and small garrison of Ultramarine successors holding the line against cultist uprisings and demon incursions. When the Death Guard committed significant forces to taking Parmenio, Guilliman recognized an opportunity to engage them in a major battle under conditions that favored Imperial forces. The Primarch deployed elements of Fleet Primus to Parmenio, including several companies of Primaris Marines, who would be fighting their first major engagement against heretic Astartes. The battle began with an orbital assault that saw drop pods and Thunderhawks descending through atmosphere, thick with toxic clouds that the Death Guard had seeded across the planet. The Primaris Marines discovered immediately that their enhanced physiology and superior equipment provided advantages, but not overwhelming superiority against the Plague Marines. The bolt rifles that the Primaris carried could engage Death Guard at longer ranges than standard bolt guns, and their increased penetrating power meant that more shots achieved kills rather than simply wounding targets. But the Death Guard's resilience meant that even mortal wounds often failed to stop them immediately. Primaris Marines reported emptying entire magazines into single plague Marines who continued advancing until catastrophic damage to their central nervous systems finally brought them down. The close quarters fighting in Parmenio's hive structures favored neither side decisively. The Primaris Marines' superior strength and coordination allowed them to execute complex tactical maneuvers, clearing rooms and corridors with efficiency that would have been impossible for standard Imperial Guard units. The Death Guard countered with their characteristic resilience and the diseases they carried. Primaris Marines who engaged Plague Marines in melee combat found their armor contaminated with fluids that ate through ceramite seals. The enhanced immune systems that the Primaris possessed provided better resistance to Nurgle's plagues than standard Space Marines enjoyed, but they were not immune. Apothecaries working behind the front lines struggled to treat Marines who had been exposed to diseases that produced symptoms ranging from uncontrollable hemorrhaging to rapid necrosis of muscle tissue. The defense of Espandor showcased Guilliman's strategic approach to the Plague Wars. This cardinal world of Ultramar served as a major administrative center and naval base, making it a critical node in the realm's defensive network. Rather than allowing the Death Guard to besiege Espandor and gradually corrupt it through sustained exposure to their plagues, Guilliman ordered aggressive counterattacks aimed at destroying Death Guard forces before they could establish their characteristic infection points. Fleet Primus elements conducted repeated raids against Death Guard positions, using the superior mobility of their forces to engage the enemy on favorable terms, and then withdraw before the Plague Marines could bring their full strength to bear. The raids on Espandor demonstrated both the effectiveness of the Primaris Marines and the limitations they faced against an enemy like the Death Guard. Strike forces would deploy via Thunderhawk or teleportation, hit Death Guard positions with overwhelming firepower, and then extract before enemy reinforcements arrived. The Primaris Marines' bolt rifles and plasma weapons could devastate Plague Marine formations when the element of surprise was achieved. But the Death Guard proved maddeningly difficult to eliminate permanently. Plague Marines who survived the initial assault would often recover from wounds that should have been fatal, their bodies knitting back together through processes that violated normal biology. The corruption they spread persisted even after Imperial forces had cleared an area, requiring specialized decontamination teams to purge the infection before the territory could be considered secure. The Battle of Hecatone represented the largest single engagement of the Plague Wars before Guilliman's final confrontation with Mortarion. This fortress world controlled access to a major warp route that connected Ultramar to neighboring sectors, making it strategically vital for both sides. The Death Guard committed massive forces to taking Hecatone, including several great unclean ones and demon engines that had been constructed in the forges of the Scourge Stars. Guilliman responded by deploying the majority of Fleet Primus to the world's defense, recognizing that losing Hecatone would compromise Ultramar's ability to receive reinforcements from the wider Indomitus Crusade. The fighting on Hecatone lasted for months, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. The fortress networks that covered the planet's surface provided excellent defensive positions for Imperial forces, but the Death Guard's persistence and the corruption they spread gradually undermined these advantages. Entire fortress complexes had to be abandoned when the plague contamination became so severe that even Space Marines couldn't operate effectively within them. The Death Guard would then occupy these positions, using them as bases for further advances. Guilliman personally led counterattacks aimed at reclaiming critical strongpoints, his presence inspiring the defenders to feats that astonished even veteran Ultramarines. The Primarch fought with a combination of tactical brilliance and physical prowess that reminded observers of accounts from the Great Crusade. His power sword carved through Plague Marines with strikes that exploited weaknesses in their corrupted armor, while his tactical assessments allowed him to coordinate attacks across multiple fronts simultaneously. The climactic confrontation between Guilliman and Mortarion occurred on Ix, the garden world that had been transformed into a demon world under the Death Guard's occupation. Mortarion had made Ix his primary base within Ultramar, establishing a palace fortress that served as both a military headquarters and a temple to Nurgle. The Demon Primarch's presence on Ajax was both a taunt and a strategic calculation. He knew Guilliman would eventually come to reclaim the world, and he prepared defenses that would make any assault catastrophically expensive. But Mortarion underestimated his brother's willingness to take risks when strategic necessity demanded it. Guilliman led a strike force directly into the heart of Ajax's corrupted landscape, teleporting into Mortarion's fortress with a select group of Victrix Guard and engaging his brother in single combat. The duel between the two Primarchs combined superhuman physical ability with the powers that each had gained since the Horus Heresy. Mortarion wielded silence, his scythe that had been empowered by Nurgle to spread disease with every strike. The Demon Primarch's wings allowed him mobility that Guilliman couldn't match, and his mastery of Nurgle's sorcery meant he could summon plagues that even a Primarch's physiology struggled to resist. Guilliman fought with the Emperor's sword, the weapon that the Master of Mankind had personally bestowed upon him. The blade burned with psychic fire that anathema to demons and the corrupted, its strikes leaving wounds that Mortarion's demonic regeneration couldn't heal. The Primarch of the Ultramarines combined his swordsmanship with tactical awareness that allowed him to anticipate Mortarion's attacks, turning his brother's superior reach and mobility into disadvantages through precise positioning and timing. The intervention that ended the duel came not from either combatant but from Nurgle himself. Kugath Plaguefather, one of Nurgle's most favored Great Unclean Ones, had been conducting his own campaign in a neighboring sector. The demon had suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing forces and resources that represented centuries of accumulation. Nurgle's response to this failure was to recall Mortarion, summoning the Demon Primarch back to the Plague God's Garden to answer for the failures of his subordinate. The summoning was not a request that Mortarion could refuse. The binding that tied him to Nurgle meant that when his patron called, he had no choice but to respond. The Demon Primarch vanished mid-strike, his form dissolving into diseased vapor that dissipated across the battlefield. Guilliman seized the opportunity that Mortarion's departure created. With the Demon Primarch gone, the Death Guard forces on Ajax lost their central coordination. The Primarch ordered immediate assaults across all fronts, committing his reserves to exploit the confusion among the Death Guard. The Emperor's sword proved particularly effective at disrupting the warp-based corruption that sustained the demon world's transformation. Where Guilliman struck with the blade, the infection that had consumed Ajax's biosphere began to recede. The effect was temporary. The corruption was too deeply rooted to be eliminated by a single weapon, no matter how powerful, but it created windows of opportunity where Imperial forces could operate without the constant pressure of environmental hazards. Over the following weeks, Fleet Primus systematically cleared Ajax of Death Guard presence, though the world itself remained too corrupted to ever fully recover its former status. The deployment of Fleet Secundus represented Guilliman's recognition that the Indomitus Crusade needed to address threats across multiple fronts simultaneously. While Fleet Primus engaged Mortarion's forces in Ultramar, and other fleet groups pushed toward the Nachmund Gauntlet or secured critical forge worlds in the Ultima Segmentum, Fleet Secundus received orders to deploy into the Segmentum Pacificus. This region had descended into chaos during the Noctis Aeterna, with warp storms isolating entire sectors and allowing threats that would normally have been contained to metastasize into existential dangers. The Charadon sector in particular had become a flashpoint where multiple hostile forces converged, threatening to establish permanent enemy presence in a region that controlled access to dozens of neighboring systems. Command of Fleet Secundus went to Captain Tor Garadon of the Imperial Fist's Third Company. The selection reflected both practical considerations and Guilliman's assessment of the specific challenges the fleet would face. Garadon had distinguished himself during the defense of the Imperium Nihilus, leading Imperial Fist's forces in grinding campaigns against Chaos Warbands and Xenos raiders. His reputation emphasized methodical siege warfare and defensive operations rather than the rapid maneuver warfare that characterized some of the other fleet commanders. The Charadon sector's strategic situation required someone who could establish fortified positions and hold them against sustained enemy pressure while simultaneously coordinating offensive operations across multiple systems. Garriden's experience with the kind of attritional warfare that the sector demanded made him the logical choice despite his relatively junior rank compared to some of the chapter masters who commanded other Crusade fleets. The strategic environment in the Charadan sector defied simple categorization. The region had been contested territory even before the Great Rift's opening, with Orc presence in multiple systems and occasional chaos raids from warbands operating out of the Maelstrom. The opening of the Great Rift transformed the sector into a convergence point for threats that would individually have required significant Imperial resources to address. Waz poured through tears in reality that the Great Rift had created, with Orc warbands emerging from the warp in locations that should have been impossible to reach through normal space travel. The Red Corsairs, Huron Blackheart's warband of renegade Space Marines, saw opportunity in the chaos and launched raids aimed at seizing Forge worlds and naval facilities. Beneath all of this, the Forge worlds of the sector struggled to maintain production while defending themselves against enemies who understood that controlling the Mechanicus manufacturing capacity would provide strategic advantages across the entire region. Forge World Metallica stood as the sector's industrial heart and the primary objective that every hostile force sought to claim or destroy. The Forge World's manufacturing capacity focused on armor production, with the Legio Metallica Titan Legion based on the planet and drawing on its foundries for maintenance and new construction. The Titans themselves represented irreplaceable strategic assets, god machines that could turn the tide of entire campaigns through their firepower and the psychological impact of their presence. The Legio Metallica had deployed elements across the sector in response to the multiple threats, but this dispersal of forces meant that no single war zone received the full weight of the Legion's power. Individual Titans or small maniples operated in support of Imperial Guard regiments or Space Marine companies, providing heavy fire support, but unable to execute the kind of coordinated Titan Legion operations that would have been possible if the machines had remained concentrated. The Orc threat emerged from the Great Rift in a manner that defied normal greenskin behavior patterns. Typically, Orc was built gradually as a powerful warlord accumulated followers and resources, eventually reaching critical mass that allowed the Wa to explode outward in a wave of violence. The Was that struck the Charadan sector appeared fully formed, with massive Orc fleets and armies materializing in real space already organized and equipped for sustained campaigns. Imperial analysts speculated that these forces had been building strength within the warp itself, drawn to the psychic turbulence of the Great Rift, and somehow surviving in that hostile environment long enough to coalesce into coherent military formations. The Orcs themselves seemed confused about their own origins, which was not unusual for greenskins, but captured bosses interrogated by inquisitorial teams gave accounts of fighting in places that matched descriptions of demon worlds or pure warp space. The Red Corsairs operated with the strategic sophistication that marked Huron Blackheart's approach to warfare. Rather than launching frontal assaults against heavily defended positions, the Renegade Warband conducted raids aimed at specific objectives that would degrade Imperial defensive capabilities over time. Supply convoys moving between Forge worlds and frontline positions disappeared, their escorts overwhelmed by Red Corsair strike forces that appeared without warning and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Astropathic relay stations came under attack, further disrupting the already degraded communication network that Imperial forces relied upon for coordination. The Red Corsairs demonstrated particular interest in capturing rather than destroying Imperial assets. Forged ships taken intact could be repurposed for the Warband's use, while captured Space Marines could be corrupted and turned into new recruits for Huron's forces. Fleet Secundus arrived in the Charadan sector to find Imperial forces already engaged across dozens of systems. The strategic situation resembled a three-dimensional puzzle where every piece affected multiple others, and solving one problem often created new complications elsewhere. Garriden established his command center on Metallica itself, recognizing that the Forge world's survival was the prerequisite for any successful campaign in the sector. The Imperial Fist's captain brought with him several companies of Primaris Marines, along with conventional Imperial Guard regiments drawn from multiple founding worlds and Mechanicus forces that included both Skitarii legions and elements of the Collegia Titanica. The integration of these diverse forces into a coherent military structure presented immediate challenges that would define much of the campaign's character. The Primaris Marines that Garrett commanded represented the first significant deployment of the new Space Marine type in the Segmentum Pacificus. The standard Imperial Guard regiments who would be fighting alongside them had heard rumors about the enhanced Space Marines, but had never seen them in action. The size difference alone was striking. Primaris Marines in their Mark X armor stood noticeably taller than standard Space Marines, and their weapons and equipment reflected design philosophies that emphasized firepower and durability over the mobility that characterized some Space Marine loadouts. The intercessor squads that formed the core of Primaris infantry formations carried bolt rifles that could engage targets at ranges where standard bolt guns became ineffective, providing fire support that bridged the gap between Space Marine close-range superiority and the long-range capabilities of Imperial Guard heavy weapons teams. The tactical integration of Primaris Marines with Imperial Guard formations required adaptation from both forces. Imperial Guard doctrine had developed over millennia to account for Space Marine support, but that doctrine assumed standard Space Marines operating in relatively small numbers as shock troops or specialized assault forces. The Primaris Marines deployed to the Cheraden sector arrived in numbers that allowed them to hold extended front lines rather than simply conducting raids or spearhead assaults. This meant that Guard regiments found themselves operating alongside Space Marine formations in sustained combat rather than the brief, intense engagements that characterized traditional Space Marine operations. The coordination challenges extended beyond simple tactical concerns. Imperial Guard supply systems were not designed to support Space Marine ammunition requirements, while Space Marine medical facilities could not treat injured guardsmen who required care that standard field hospitals couldn't provide. The Mechanicus forces operating in the sector added another layer of complexity to the command structure. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintained its own hierarchy and command protocols, with tech priests answering to Forge World authorities rather than Imperial military commanders. Garrett navigated this political reality through a combination of formal respect for Mechanicus autonomy and practical arrangements that allowed for effective coordination. The Imperial Fist's captain established liaison teams that included tech marines from his own chapter, officers who spoke the Mechanicus dialect of High Gothic and understood enough about Forge World politics to facilitate communication between the different military branches. The Skitarii legions that the Mechanicus deployed operated according to doctrines that emphasized ranged firepower and coordinated volleys, making them natural partners for Imperial Guard formations, but requiring different tactical approaches than Space Marine assaults. The defense of Forge World in Caladian demonstrated both the effectiveness of combined arms operations and the brutal attrition that characterized the Cheraden campaign. This secondary Forge World specialized in munitions production, supplying ammunition for Imperial forces across multiple sectors. The Orcs recognized the strategic value of the target and committed a substantial wa to its capture, with multiple clans coordinating their assaults in a manner that suggested either unusual discipline for greenskins or the presence of a particularly cunning warlord. The Orc forces landed across Caladian's industrial zones, their drop pods and assault craft crashing through defensive fire that destroyed hundreds of craft, but failed to stop the overall landing. Within hours, Orc mobs were fighting through the forge complexes, their numbers overwhelming the Skitarii defenders who had been assigned to protect the facilities. Garreden's response to the Caladian crisis involved deploying a relief force built around Primaris Marine Intercessor and Hellblaster squads, supported by Imperial Guard armored regiments and a maniple of Warhound Scout Titans from Legio Metallica. The combined force demonstrated the advantages that proper integration could provide. The Primaris Marines advanced through the industrial zones, their bolt rifles clearing orc mobs from defensive positions, while their enhanced durability allowed them to absorb casualties that would have stopped standard infantry. The Imperial Guard armor followed behind the Space Marine advance, their battle cannons and las cannons providing fire support against orc vehicles, and the makeshift fortifications that the Greenskins constructed from scavenged industrial equipment. The Warhound Titans operated on the flanks, their speed allowing them to respond to orc breakthroughs, while their weapons eliminated targets that infantry and armor struggled to engage effectively. The orcs on Caladian fought with the characteristic enthusiasm that made them such dangerous opponents despite their technological inferiority. The Greenskins seemed to view the battle as entertainment rather than a life or death struggle, with mobs charging into Imperial fire while bellowing war cries and firing their crude weapons with more enthusiasm than accuracy. But beneath the apparent chaos, the orc assault followed patterns that indicated coordination from a central authority. When Imperial forces concentrated against one orc position, other mobs would launch diversionary attacks that forced the defenders to split their attention. The orcs deployed looted Imperial vehicles alongside their own ramshackle constructions, and these captured tanks operated with enough tactical sense to suggest that their crews understood basic armored warfare principles, even if they executed them with typical orc disregard for safety or efficiency. The fighting in Caladian's forge complexes highlighted the challenges of urban combat in industrial environments. The facilities had been designed for manufacturing efficiency rather than defensive considerations, with open spaces that provided excellent fields of fire but limited cover for defenders. The orcs used the industrial equipment itself as both weapons and fortifications, activating forge machinery to create hazards that killed indiscriminately or piling scrap metal into barriers that absorbed tremendous amounts of fire before collapsing. Primaris Marines advancing through these environments found that their superior equipment and training provided advantages but not immunity to the dangers. Hellblaster squads armed with plasma incinerators could eliminate orc mobs with devastating efficiency, but the superheated industrial atmosphere and the electromagnetic interference from active forge equipment caused plasma weapons to overheat more frequently than normal, forcing the Marines to moderate their rate of fire or risk catastrophic weapon failures. The Red Corsairs' raid on the naval facilities at Daravar demonstrated the different character of threat that Chaos forces represented compared to the orcs. Where the Greenskins attacked with overwhelming numbers and crude enthusiasm, the Red Corsairs executed precisely planned operations that exploited specific vulnerabilities in Imperial defenses. The naval yards at Daravar serviced and repaired vessels from across the sector, making them a critical node in the Imperial Navy's logistics network. The Red Corsairs' strike force infiltrated the system using captured Imperial identification codes, allowing them to approach the orbital facilities without triggering immediate defensive responses. By the time the deception was discovered, Red Corsairs' boarding parties had already breached multiple stations, their Chaos Space Marines cutting through naval security forces and seizing control of critical systems. The response to the Daravar raid required coordination between Fleet Secundus elements and the local naval forces. Garridan deployed Primaris Reaver squads via teleportation directly into the compromised stations, recognizing that the close-quarters combat environment favored Space Marines over naval armsmen, but that speed was essential to prevent the Red Corsairs from escaping with captured vessels. The Reavers operated in the kind of environment where their specialized equipment proved most effective. The grapnel launchers and grav chutes that the squads carried allowed them to move through the station's three-dimensional structure with speed that conventional infantry couldn't match, while their shock grenades and combat knives made them lethal opponents in the cramped corridors and compartments where ranged weapons became less effective. The battles aboard the Daravar stations revealed the tactical sophistication that marked Red Corsairs' operations. The Chaos Space Marines had positioned themselves to control access points and critical systems, forcing the Imperial counterattack to fight through prepared positions, where the defenders held every advantage. The Red Corsairs demonstrated familiarity with Imperial naval architecture that allowed them to predict Imperial assault routes and prepare ambushes accordingly. They deployed specialized equipment that suggested significant resources, conversion beamers that could punch through bulkheads and destroy entire compartments, and warp-tainted explosives that created tears in reality when detonated. The Primaris Reavers encountered Chaos Marines who fought with the experience of veterans who had been waging war for centuries, their power armor bearing the marks of countless battles, and their weapons modified with attachments that reflected individual preferences developed over lifetimes of combat. The strategic importance of the Forge worlds in the Charadon sector extended beyond their immediate military value. The manufacturing capacity that places like Metallica and Enkaladion represented could not be easily replaced or relocated. Forge worlds required centuries to establish, with their industrial infrastructure built around specific geological features and their populations trained in technical disciplines that took generations to master. The loss of even a single Forge world would create supply shortages that would be felt across multiple sectors for decades. This reality shaped Garredon's strategic approach to the campaign. He could not afford to trade territory for time or accept the loss of industrial capacity in exchange for tactical advantages elsewhere. Every Forge world had to be held, every manufacturing center defended, regardless of the cost in lives and materiel that such an approach demanded. The evolution of combined arms tactics during the Charadon campaign reflected both the specific challenges of the operational environment and the broader changes that the Indomitus Crusade was introducing to Imperial military doctrine. The traditional separation between Space Marine operations and conventional Imperial Guard campaigns had been breaking down even before the introduction of Primaris Marines, driven by the reality that the Imperium faced too many threats across too broad a front for such rigid distinctions to remain practical. The Charadon sector accelerated this process, with Garredon establishing integrated command structures that treated Space Marine companies, Imperial Guard regiments, and Mechanicus forces as components of a single military system, rather than separate organizations that occasionally cooperated. The coordination challenges that this integration created were substantial. Space Marine companies operated on timescales measured in hours or days, with individual squads capable of independent action and rapid redeployment to respond to changing tactical situations. Imperial Guard regiments functioned according to more rigid command structures, with orders flowing down through multiple levels of hierarchy and units expecting clear directives about objectives and methods. The Mechanicus forces added their own complications, with Skitarii cohorts responding to datastream commands from their Tech Priest controllers and Titan crews operating according to protocols that dated back to the dark age of technology. Creating a command system that could accommodate these different operational styles while maintaining unified strategic direction required innovations that would have been impossible without the communications equipment and command staff that Fleet Secundus brought to the sector. The deployment of Fleet Tertius represented the most audacious and perilous undertaking of the entire Indomitus Crusade. While Fleets Primus and Secundus operated within Imperium Sanctus, where the Astronomican's light still reached and astropathic communication functioned with at least some reliability, Fleet Tertius received orders to cross the Cicatrix Maledictum itself and prosecute the Crusade within Imperium Nihilus. The strategic logic behind this deployment was sound. The worlds beyond the Great Rift faced complete isolation from Terra, their populations enduring decades or centuries of warfare without reinforcement or resupply. Without intervention, these regions would inevitably fall to chaos, xenos invasion, or simple collapse into anarchy. But the practical challenges of operating in Imperium Nihilus exceeded anything Imperial forces had faced since the Age of Strife. The Astronomican's light did not reach beyond the Great Rift. This fundamental fact shaped every aspect of operations in Imperium Nihilus. The psychic beacon that had guided navigators for 10,000 years simply vanished once ships crossed the rift's boundary, leaving navigator houses to plot courses through the warp using techniques that had not been necessary since before the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne. Some navigators reported being able to perceive faint echoes of the astronomic and psychic impressions that flickered in and out of perception, like distant lightning on a dark horizon. Others claimed they could navigate by following the psychic signatures of human populations, using the collective presence of billions of souls as makeshift beacons. Neither method provided the reliability that standard warp navigation offered, and the casualty rates among ships attempting the crossing reflected this reality. The warp storms that churned throughout Imperium Nihilus made even these improvised navigation techniques unreliable. Ships that entered the warp on courses calculated to bring them to specific destinations emerged thousands of light years off target, their navigators unable to explain what had gone wrong with their calculations. The temporal distortions that had characterized the Noctis Eterna persisted in Imperium Nihilus long after they had subsided in Imperium Sanctus. Fleet Tertius vessels that made what should have been weeks-long warp jumps arrived at their destinations to discover that months or years had passed in real space. The inverse occurred with equal frequency. Ships spent what felt like months in the warp only to emerge and discover that mere days had elapsed. The effect on crew morale was devastating, with naval personnel never certain whether they would arrive too late to affect the battles they had been dispatched to fight, or whether they would find that wars they expected to be ongoing had ended decades earlier. Astropathic communication across the Great Rift proved nearly impossible. The psychic choir chambers that allowed astropaths to send messages across interstellar distances required a relatively stable warp environment to function. The turbulence within and around the Cicatrix Maledictum disrupted these transmissions, with messages either failing to reach their intended recipients or arriving so garbled that they conveyed no useful information. Astropaths attempting to send messages through the rift reported experiencing visions of such intensity that many suffered permanent psychological damage. Some described perceiving the attention of entities within the warp, vast presences that noticed the astropaths' attempts to communicate and responded with psychic assaults that burned out the senders' minds. The Inquisition documented cases of entire astropathic choirs dying simultaneously when attempting coordinated transmissions, their bodies found withered in their choir chambers with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. Fleet Tertius operated under the command of Chapter Master Malachim Foros of the Lamenter's chapter. The selection raised eyebrows among those familiar with the Lamenter's history and their reputation for suffering misfortune that bordered on the supernatural. The chapter had been nearly destroyed during the Badab War, then decimated again during the disastrous Corinth Crusade, and had spent centuries on a penitent crusade attempting to rebuild their strength and reputation. Guilliman's decision to place Foros in command of such a critical operation reflected the Primarch's assessment that the Lamenter's experience with operating under desperate circumstances made them ideal for the challenges of Imperium Nihilus. The chapter had learned to fight without hope of reinforcement, to maintain discipline and effectiveness even when facing overwhelming odds, and to endure losses that would have broken formations with less tragic histories. The crossing of the Great Rift itself tested the limits of what Imperial voidships could survive. The Cicatrix Maledictum was not simply a region of unstable warp space, it was a wound in reality, where the materium and immaterium bled into each other with catastrophic results. Ships attempting the crossing reported their Geller fields straining under assault from entities that manifested within the fields themselves, bypassing the protective barriers that should have kept demons confined to the warp. Crew members suffered spontaneous mutations, their bodies transforming in ways that reflected the nature of the Chaos Gods, whose power saturated the rift. Naval officers documented incidents of entire decks becoming corrupted, their bulkheads growing fleshy protrusions, or their atmosphere becoming thick with spores that caused hallucinations in anyone who breathed them. The fleet elements that survived the crossing emerged in systems that had been isolated from Imperial contact for what the inhabitants experienced as decades or centuries. The temporal distortions meant that while only years had passed in Imperium Sanctus, since the Great Rift's opening, some worlds in Imperium Nihilus had endured generations of isolation. The populations of these worlds had adapted to their circumstances in ways that reflected both human resilience and the corrupting influence of prolonged exposure to warp instability. Fleet Tertius forces discovered worlds where imperial governance had collapsed entirely, replaced by tribal confederations or warlord states that retained only the barest memory of their connection to Terra. Other worlds had maintained their imperial structure through sheer determination, with planetary governors and ecclesiarchy officials preserving order despite having no contact with higher authority and no hope of reinforcement. The world of Naiads provided Fleet Tertius with its first major test in Imperium Nihilus. This hive world had been a productive member of the Imperium before the Great Rift's opening, its massive urban complexes housing billions of workers who labored in manufactorums that produced equipment for PDF forces across the sector. The isolation had transformed Naiads into something that barely resembled its former self. The planetary government had fractured into competing factions, each controlling different hive cities and claiming to represent legitimate imperial authority. Some factions had maintained orthodox imperial practices, their populations continuing to worship the emperor and follow the dictates of the Ministorum despite receiving no guidance from off-world. Others had developed syncretic belief systems that combined emperor worship with practices that the ecclesiarchy would have condemned as heretical, incorporating elements of local tradition or desperate improvisation born from decades of isolation. The most troubling discovery on Naiads concerned the hive complexes that had fallen silent during the initial reconnaissance. Lamenter's forces deploying into these regions found populations that had been completely corrupted by chaos, their transformation so gradual that many inhabitants seemed unaware of what they had become. The isolation had created conditions where chaos cults could operate openly, their influence spreading through communities that had no inquisitorial presence to identify and purge the corruption. By the time Fleet Tertius arrived, entire hive cities worshipped the ruinous powers as openly as orthodox populations worshipped the emperor. The corrupted populations had not transformed into the obvious mutants and cultists that characterized rapid chaos corruption. Instead, they maintained the appearance and structure of imperial society while dedicating their labor and worship to the dark gods. The strategic decision facing Foros on Naiads exemplified the moral and practical dilemmas that would define operations throughout Imperium Nihilus. The corrupted hive cities housed billions of people, and their manufactorums still produced equipment that could be valuable for imperial forces if they could be reclaimed. But the depth of chaos corruption made redemption unlikely, and attempting to purge the corruption while preserving the population would require resources that Fleet Tertius could not afford to commit. The chapter master made the decision to conduct exterminatus on the corrupted hives, using cyclonic torpedoes to reduce them to molten slag. The uncorrupted hives received reinforcement in the form of Primaris Marines and Imperial Guard regiments, along with ecclesiarchy officials who would work to identify and eliminate any remaining chaos influence before it could spread. The campaign on Sangua Terra demonstrated the challenges of operating on worlds where the passage of time had diverged dramatically from the rest of the Imperium. This shrine world had been a major pilgrimage site before the Great Rift's opening, its cathedrals and reliquaries drawing the faithful from across multiple sectors. The temporal distortion that affected Sangua Terra meant that while only a few years had passed in the wider galaxy, the world's population had experienced nearly a century of isolation. Multiple generations had been born, lived, and died without any contact with the broader Imperium. The planetary government had adapted by developing increasingly elaborate interpretations of the Emperor's will, with the ecclesiarchy authorities on the world claiming direct divine guidance in the absence of communication with the Synod Terra. The Lamenters arriving on Sangua Terra discovered a population that viewed the Space Marines with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. The inhabitants had maintained their faith in the Emperor and their loyalty to the Imperium, but their understanding of both had evolved in directions that reflected their isolation. The local ecclesiarchy preached doctrines that diverged from orthodox imperial cult teachings, emphasizing themes of endurance and self-sacrifice that resonated with a population that had survived decades of hardship. The planetary defense forces had developed tactics and equipment that showed creativity born from necessity. Unable to receive resupply from forge worlds, they had learned to maintain and modify their weapons using locally available materials, creating hybrid designs that combined imperial technology with improvised components. The integration of Sanguiterra back into the imperial fold required diplomatic skills that Space Marines rarely needed to employ. Foros recognized that simply declaring the local religious practices heretical and demanding immediate compliance with orthodox doctrine would alienate a population that had remained loyal to the Imperium under circumstances that had driven other worlds to rebellion or chaos worship. The chapter master negotiated with the planetary authorities, acknowledging their faithfulness while gently steering them back toward alignment with broader imperial practice. The compromise that emerged allowed Sanguiterra to maintain some of its unique traditions, while accepting the authority of the ecclesiarchy representatives that Fleet Tertius brought with it. The battles against the Red Corsairs' expanding empire in Imperium Nihilus revealed how Huron Blackheart's forces had exploited the isolation to build a network of controlled systems that rivaled some imperial sectors in size and organization. The Red Corsairs had always operated as raiders and pirates, striking imperial targets and then retreating to their fortress monastery on New Badab before retribution could arrive. The opening of the Great Rift and the isolation of Imperium Nihilus had allowed Huron to pursue more ambitious objectives. The Red Corsairs conquered worlds outright rather than simply raiding them, establishing garrison forces and extracting tribute from conquered populations. The Warband recruited from these populations, using a combination of coercion and promises of power to swell their ranks with new Chaos Space Marines created from captured Gene Seed and corrupted aspirants. The Red Corsairs' expansion had created a proto-empire centered on the Maelstrom region, with tendrils of control extending into neighboring sectors. Huron ruled this domain with the same combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless pragmatism that had characterized his leadership of the Astral Claws before their fall to chaos. The Red Corsairs' controlled worlds maintained functional governments and industrial capacity, though all served the ultimate purpose of supporting Huron's military operations. Fleet Tertius forces engaging Red Corsairs' positions discovered that the enemy had access to equipment and resources that suggested significant manufacturing capability, new ships, freshly produced ammunition and equipment, and even what appeared to be newly created Chaos Space Marines bearing Red Corsairs' heraldry. The Battle of Chogoris demonstrated both the Red Corsairs' capabilities and the unique advantages that Fleet Tertius brought to operations in Imperium Nihilus. The home world of the White Scars chapter had been besieged by Red Corsairs forces seeking to capture the Gene Seed repositories and recruiting populations that the world housed. The White Scars had fought a desperate defensive campaign, their numbers reduced by years of attrition, and their ability to conduct the mobile warfare that characterized their combat doctrine severely limited by the need to defend fixed positions. The arrival of Fleet Tertius provided the besieged chapter with reinforcements that allowed them to break the siege and launch counterattacks against Red Corsairs' positions across the system. The relief of Chogoris involved coordination between Lamentor's forces, White Scars survivors, and newly deployed Primaris Marines created from White Scars' Gene Seed. The cultural differences between these forces created friction that Foros had to manage carefully. The White Scars maintained traditions that emphasized individual initiative and the kind of rapid maneuver warfare that their Primarch Jagatai Khan had perfected during the Great Crusade. The Primaris Marines created from White Scars, Gene Seed had been trained in combat doctrines that reflected Guilliman's preferences for coordinated operations and combined arms tactics. The Lamentors brought their own approach, shaped by centuries of fighting as an understrength chapter that could not afford the casualties that aggressive tactics often produced. The establishment of the Sanctus Wall fortification network represented Fleet Tertius's most ambitious strategic project in Imperium Nihilus. The concept originated from recognition that the Imperium could not hope to defend every world in the region with mobile forces. There were too many systems, too few ships, and warp travel remained too unreliable for rapid response to threats. Instead, Fleet Tertius would establish a network of heavily fortified systems along the edge of the Great Rift, creating strongpoints that could serve as bases for offensive operations, while also providing defended positions that could resist enemy assaults even when cut off from reinforcement. The Sanctus Wall would not be a continuous defensive line in the traditional sense. The three-dimensional nature of space made such concepts meaningless, but rather a network of mutually supporting fortresses that controlled key warp routes and strategic locations. The construction of Sanctus Wall fortifications required resources that Fleet Tertius struggled to provide. Each fortress system needed orbital defense platforms, ground-based fortifications, garrison forces, and the industrial capacity to maintain and resupply these assets. The Adeptus Mechanicus elements attached to Fleet Tertius contributed technical expertise and some manufacturing capability, but the scale of the project demanded that local worlds contribute their own resources and labor. Pharos negotiated with planetary governors and Forge world authorities, convincing them that the investment in fortifications would provide security that mobile defense forces could never guarantee. The chapter master leveraged the prestige of the Indomitus Crusade and Guilliman's authority to overcome resistance from officials who were reluctant to commit resources to projects that would take years to complete. The worlds that Fleet Tertius discovered in the deeper regions of Imperium Nihilus defied easy categorization. Some had maintained recognizable imperial culture despite their isolation, their populations continuing to follow the dictates of the administratum and ecclesiarchy, even though no higher authority remained to enforce compliance. These worlds often demonstrated remarkable resilience, having fought off chaos incursions, xenos raids, and internal threats through nothing more than determination and faith. Other worlds had developed in directions that reflected the unique circumstances of their isolation. Fleet Tertius encountered planets where the entire population had been militarized out of necessity, with every citizen from childhood trained in combat and organized into defensive militias. The distinction between civilian and military had ceased to exist on these worlds, replaced by a culture where survival demanded that everyone be ready to fight at any moment. The most disturbing discoveries involved worlds where the isolation and constant exposure to warp instability had produced mutations in the human population. These were not the obvious corruptions of chaos. The inhabitants showed no signs of worshipping the ruinous powers and maintained their loyalty to the emperor, but rather subtle changes in physiology or psychology that marked them as divergent from baseline humanity. Some populations had developed enhanced resistance to radiation or toxic atmospheres, adaptations that allowed them to survive on worlds where environmental conditions had deteriorated during the isolation. Others showed psychological changes, with entire populations displaying unusual behavioral patterns or cognitive abilities that suggested psychic potential. The inquisitorial representatives attached to Fleet Tertius struggled with how to classify these populations. Were they acceptable variants of humanity adapting to extreme circumstances, or were they abhumans who should be subject to the same restrictions and prejudices that the Imperium applied to sanctioned abhuman species? The logistics of delivering Primaris reinforcements, new equipment, and Guilliman's edicts to Space Marine chapters scattered across the galaxy required an organizational effort that rivaled the military operations of the Indomitus Crusade itself. The Primarch recognized that simply creating millions of enhanced Space Marines would accomplish nothing if those warriors could not reach the chapters that needed them. The solution took the form of the Torchbearer fleets, dozens of specialized naval formations tasked with carrying the new Marines, their equipment, and the Primarch's instructions to every loyalist chapter that could be reached. Each fleet consisted of transport vessels escorted by warships from the Imperial Navy, with contingents of Primaris Marines held in stasis during transit and Adeptus Mechanicus personnel to oversee the delivery of new weapon patterns and armor designs that Belisarius Cawl had developed. The organization of the torchbearer fleets reflected Guilliman's understanding that different chapters would require different approaches. Some fleets carried reinforcements for chapters known to be Codex compliant and likely to accept the Primaris without significant resistance. These formations could travel with relatively light escorts, as their destinations were typically in secure regions where the primary challenge was navigation rather than combat. Other fleets headed for chapters with reputations for independence or suspicion of outside authority, and these formations received heavier escorts along with diplomatic personnel who understood the delicate negotiations that might be required. The largest and most heavily armed torchbearer fleets were assigned to reach chapters known to be engaged in active combat or located in regions where enemy activity made the journey exceptionally dangerous. The Primaris Marines designated for delivery existed in a strange state of limbo during their transit. Cawl's stasis technology kept them in suspended animation, their consciousness frozen at the moment of their final training exercises on Mars. Many of these warriors had been created decades or even centuries earlier, held in reserve until the moment when Guilliman would authorize their deployment. The Primaris carried no chapter identity during transit. They wore unpainted Mark X armor and bore no heraldry, earning them the designation Grey Shields. This blank slate status served multiple purposes. It allowed the Primaris to be assigned to whichever chapters most urgently needed reinforcement, rather than being committed to specific formations years before deployment. It also meant that the Primaris would learn their chapter's culture and traditions from their new brothers, rather than arriving with preconceptions about how their chapter should operate. The Ultramarines received their Primaris reinforcements with enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. Marnius Calgar understood immediately that these enhanced warriors represented the future of his chapter and the broader Adeptus Astartes. The chapter master had witnessed Guilliman's resurrection and fought alongside the Primarch during the Terran Crusade, which gave him perspective that many other chapter leaders lacked. Calgar saw the Primaris not as a challenge to existing Space Marines, but as a necessary evolution in response to the existential threats facing the Imperium. The Ultramarines integrated their Primaris reinforcements rapidly, assigning them to companies alongside standard Marines, and ensuring that the newcomers learned the chapter's traditions through direct mentorship rather than formal instruction. The Ultramarines' enthusiasm for the Primaris extended to their successor chapters as well, with many of the Ultramarines' descended formations following their progenitors' example in welcoming the reinforcements. The Imperial Fists demonstrated their characteristic pragmatism in accepting Primaris reinforcements. Chapter Master Vladimir Pug recognized that the chapter had suffered severe losses during recent campaigns and needed every warrior who could hold a bolter. The Imperial Fists integrated their Primaris following strict protocols that emphasized the chapter's traditions of siege warfare and defensive operations. The new Marines received intensive instruction in the specific techniques that the Imperial Fists had refined over millennia, the proper methods for fortifying positions, the mathematical calculations required to determine optimal fields of fire, and the psychological discipline necessary to hold a defensive line against overwhelming assault. The Imperial Fists approach created Primaris Marines who functioned identically to their standard brethren in terms of doctrine and culture, despite their enhanced physiology and different equipment. The Blood Angels' reception of their Primaris reinforcements was complicated by concerns about the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, the genetic flaws that had plagued the chapter since their Primarch Sanguinius fell during the Horus Heresy. Cawl claimed that his improvements to the gene seed implantation process had eliminated, or at least reduced, the severity of these afflictions. The Blood Angels' sanguinary priests conducted extensive testing of the Primaris Marines created from their gene seed, searching for any signs of the psychological instability that characterized the Red Thirst or the death visions that marked the Black Rage. Initial results suggested that the Primaris did indeed show reduced susceptibility to these conditions, though whether this represented a permanent fix or simply delayed onset remained unclear. The Blood Angels integrated their Primaris cautiously, assigning them to formations where experienced sergeants could monitor them for any signs of their genetic curse manifesting. The Space Wolves' response to the Torchbearer fleet that reached Fenris reflected the chapter's deep-seated suspicion of anything that smacked of outside interference in their traditions. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf who led the chapter, viewed the Primaris with skepticism that bordered on hostility. The Space Wolves had always maintained that their gene seed and recruitment practices were gifts from their Primarch Leman Russ' sacred traditions that should not be altered by tech priests from Mars regardless of how impressive their credentials might be. The presence of Primaris Marines created from Space Wolves' gene seed, but trained in combat doctrines that emphasized ranged firepower over the close-quarters savagery that the chapter preferred created immediate friction. Grimnar eventually accepted the reinforcements after extracting assurances that the Primaris would learn Space Wolves' traditions and adapt to the chapter's culture rather than the reverse. The integration process on Fenris involved subjecting the Primaris to the same trials that standard Space Wolves aspirants endured, albeit in modified form, since the Primaris had already received their gene seed implants. The new Marines underwent the blooding, hunting the massive predators that roamed Fenris's death worlds to prove their worth as warriors. They participated in the Feast of Morkai, consuming the flesh of defeated enemies in rituals that the chapter maintained despite the ecclesiarchy's discomfort with such practices. The Space Wolves assigned their Primaris to packs led by experienced wolf guards who taught them the chapter's preferred tactics: the sudden assault from unexpected angles, the use of close combat weapons to tear apart enemies who expected Space Marines to maintain range, and the importance of pack cohesion that allowed individual warriors to take risks knowing their brothers would cover their flanks. The Black Templars' reaction to their Torchbearer fleet represented the most hostile reception that any chapter gave to the Primaris reinforcements. High Marshal Helbrecht viewed Call's work with suspicion that reflected the chapter's general attitude toward the Adeptus Mechanicus and anyone who claimed to improve upon the Emperor's design. The Black Templars had never accepted the Codex Astartes' limitations on chapter size, maintaining a strength that far exceeded the nominal 1,000 Marines through their organization into multiple Crusade fleets. The arrival of Primaris Marines created from Black Templars' gene seed, but trained according to Guilliman's preferences, rather than the chapter's traditions, struck Helbrecht as an attempt to force compliance with standards that the Black Templars had rejected for 10,000 years. The High Marshal's concerns extended beyond simple traditionalism. The Black Templars maintained a culture that emphasized zealous faith in the Emperor's divinity, aggressive prosecution of crusades against all enemies of mankind, and a chain of command that gave individual marshals tremendous autonomy in how they conducted their operations. The Primaris Marines arriving from Mars had been trained in combat doctrines that emphasized coordination and combined arms tactics, approaches that worked well for chapters that operated as unified formations, but fit poorly with the Black Templars' dispersed Crusade fleet structure. Helbrecht eventually accepted the reinforcements after Guilliman personally intervened, though the chapter master made clear that the Primaris would adapt to Black Templars' traditions rather than the chapter changing its practices to accommodate the newcomers. The integration of Primaris Marines into existing chapters created challenges that went beyond simple questions of combat doctrine. The physical differences between Standard and Primaris Marines were immediately obvious. The enhanced warriors stood taller, their armor was bulkier, and their weapons were scaled differently. These differences created practical complications in terms of equipment compatibility and vehicle transport capacity. Rhino transports designed to carry 10 standard Space Marines could only accommodate 6 Primaris in their Mark 10 armor. Drop pods required modifications to their internal configuration to handle the size difference. Even something as simple as doorways in chapter fortresses sometimes proved too small for Primaris Marines to pass through comfortably in full armor. The cultural integration proved even more complex than the physical logistics. Space Marine chapters developed traditions and customs over centuries or millennia, creating organizational cultures that defined how individual Marines understood their identity and purpose. Standard Marines who had served their chapters for decades or centuries viewed the Primaris with a mixture of curiosity and resentment. The enhanced warriors represented an implicit suggestion that existing Space Marines were somehow inadequate, that the chapters needed improvement to meet the current threats. This perception created tensions even in chapters that officially welcomed the Primaris reinforcements. Veterans who had earned their reputation through centuries of combat found themselves outperformed in training exercises by Primaris Marines who had never fought a real battle. The Rubicon Primaris procedure offered a solution to some of these tensions while creating new complications. Call had developed a process that allowed existing Space Marines to undergo the surgeries and genetic modifications necessary to transform them into Primaris Marines. The procedure was extraordinarily dangerous. Early estimates suggested that perhaps half of the Marines who attempted the crossing would die during the process, their bodies unable to survive the trauma of having new organs implanted and their existing physiology altered. But for Marines who survived, the Rubicon offered a path to enhanced capabilities without the cultural disconnect that characterized the Gray-Shield Primaris arriving from Mars. A veteran sergeant who crossed the Rubicon retained all his experience, his knowledge of chapter traditions, and his relationships with his brothers, while gaining the physical advantages that the Primaris modifications provided. Marnius Calgar became the first chapter master to undergo the Rubicon Primaris, a decision that carried immense symbolic weight. The leader of the Ultramarines submitted himself to a procedure that might kill him, demonstrating his faith in Call's work and his willingness to embrace the changes that the Primaris represented. Calgar's survival and successful transformation provided a powerful example for other chapters. If the chapter master of the Ultramarines, one of the most respected leaders in the entire Adeptus Astartes, judged the Rubicon worth the risk, then perhaps other Marines should consider following his example. The procedure's danger meant that chapters approached it cautiously, typically restricting access to veterans whose experience and skills justified the risk of losing them. Junior Marines continued to serve in their standard form, waiting until they had proven themselves worthy of consideration for the Rubicon. The delivery of new equipment patterns alongside the Primaris reinforcements created additional complications for chapters attempting to integrate the newcomers. The Mark X power armor that Primaris Marines wore incorporated design elements that had been lost since the Horus Heresy, combined with innovations that Call had developed during his millennia of research. The armor's power systems were more efficient than those used in Mark VII or Mark VIII plate, allowing it to support more sophisticated targeting systems and weapon interfaces. But this efficiency came at the cost of increased complexity. Tech Marines trained in maintaining standard power armor patterns found themselves struggling to service Mark X suits, requiring additional instruction from Mechanicus personnel who accompanied the torchbearer fleets. The bolt rifles that formed the primary armament of Primaris infantry represented a similar mixture of improvement and complication. The weapons fired rounds with greater velocity and penetrating power than standard bolt guns, extending their effective range and allowing Primaris Marines to engage targets that would have been beyond the reach of traditional Space Marine infantry. The increased performance came from modifications to the bolt round design and improvements to the weapon's firing mechanism, changes that required different maintenance procedures and ammunition that was not interchangeable with standard bolter rounds. Chapters that accepted Primaris reinforcements found themselves managing two separate logistics chains for infantry weapons, a complication that strained supply systems already stressed by the disruptions caused by the Great Rift. The torchbearer fleet's journeys to reach their assigned chapters often became military campaigns in their own right. The warp storms that continued to churn across the galaxy made navigation unpredictable, and many fleets found themselves forced to fight their way through systems that had fallen to enemy control during the Noctis Aeterna. The Torchbearer fleet assigned to reach the Crimson Fists on Rin's world discovered that the chapter's home world had been invaded by a massive Orkwa during the isolation period. The fleet's commander made the decision to deploy the Primaris reinforcements immediately upon arrival, rather than waiting for the situation to stabilize, throwing the Greyshields into combat alongside the embattled chapter. The Primaris Marines fought their first battles wearing unpainted armor, learning Crimson Fist's traditions through shared combat rather than formal instruction. The race to reach chapters before they were destroyed by the threats surrounding them created situations where Torchbearer fleets arrived to find their assigned recipients reduced to a fraction of their former strength or scattered across multiple systems. The fleet carrying reinforcements for the Celestial Lions discovered that the chapter had been nearly annihilated by a combination of Orc attacks and what appeared to be suspiciously precise targeting by Imperial forces that some suspected reflected inquisitorial involvement. The Primaris Marines designated for the Celestial Lions found themselves forming the core of a rebuilt chapter, their numbers exceeding the surviving Standard Marines and creating an unusual situation where the newcomers defined the chapter's culture rather than adapting to existing traditions. The Torchbearer fleets that ventured into Imperium Nihilus faced challenges that exceeded those encountered in Imperium Sanctus. The absence of the Astronomicon meant that navigation required techniques that had not been used since before the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne. Some fleets never reached their destinations, disappearing into the warp without trace or emerging in locations thousands of light years from their intended targets. The temporal distortions that characterized warp travel in Imperium Nihilus meant that fleets sometimes arrived decades after they had departed from their staging areas, their Primaris reinforcements emerging from stasis to discover that the chapters they had been sent to reinforce had already adapted to fighting without them or had been destroyed entirely. The delivery of Guilliman's edicts alongside the Primaris reinforcements forced chapters to confront questions about their relationship with the Primarch and the broader Imperium. The edicts covered a wide range of subjects, tactical doctrines that Guilliman wanted all chapters to adopt, organizational reforms aimed at improving coordination between different chapters, and religious matters where the Primarch attempted to moderate the more extreme expressions of emperor worship that had developed during his absence. Some chapters accepted these edicts as binding orders from one of the emperor's sons, implementing the changes immediately and without question. Others viewed the edicts as suggestions from a respected but not infallible authority, implementing those changes that seemed practical while ignoring directives that conflicted with chapter traditions or local circumstances. The varied receptions that different chapters gave to the Torchbearer fleets reflected the fundamental diversity of the Adeptus Astartes. 10,000 years of independent operation had created hundreds of distinct organizational cultures, each shaped by its Primarch's legacy, its chapter's history, and the specific threats it had faced. The Primaris reinforcements and Guilliman's edicts represented an attempt to impose some degree of standardization on this diversity, to create a more unified Adeptus Astartes that could coordinate its actions across the galaxy. The success of this effort varied dramatically based on each chapter's specific circumstances and the personalities of its leadership. The result was an Adeptus Astartes that incorporated Primaris Marines in dozens of different ways, creating new traditions even as it struggled to maintain old ones. The scope of the Indomitus Crusade extended far beyond the operations of the primary fleet groups and the delivery missions of the Torchbearer fleets. Across hundreds of sectors, Imperial forces engaged threats that ranged from familiar enemies grown to unprecedented strength to entirely new manifestations of xenos aggression and chaos corruption. The fragmentation caused by the Great Rift meant that many of these campaigns developed independently, with local commanders making strategic decisions based on incomplete information and resources that often proved inadequate for the tasks they faced. The patterns that emerged from these diverse conflicts revealed both the adaptability of Imperial forces and the magnitude of the challenges that the Imperium confronted in the wake of the galaxy's division. The Orc threat that emerged in the years following the Great Rift's opening exceeded anything the Imperium had faced since the War of the Beast in the 32nd millennium. The psychic turbulence generated by the Cicatrix maledictum seemed to energize the greenskin species, with wars erupting across multiple sectors simultaneously. These were not the typical Orc incursions that Imperial forces had learned to contain through established protocols: concentrated bombardment of Orc-held worlds, elimination of war bosses to fracture greenskin unity, and systematic destruction of their crude industrial capacity. The new wars demonstrated organization and persistence that suggested the emergence of war bosses whose power approached that of the legendary beast. Intelligence reports from multiple war zones described Orcs who stood twice the height of normal greenskins, their bodies swollen with muscle mass that allowed them to tear apart Space Marines in close combat. These massive specimens commanded the loyalty of entire wars, unifying clans that would normally fight each other as enthusiastically as they fought Imperial forces. The Octarius sector became a focal point for understanding the scale of the Orc threat. This region had been deliberately infected with a Tyranid splinter fleet by Inquisitor Cryptman decades earlier, with the intention of creating a conflict that would consume both xenos species and prevent them from threatening Imperial space. The strategy had worked for years, with Orcs and Tyranids locked in a grinding war of attrition that consumed resources from both sides. The opening of the Great Rift altered this equation dramatically. The Orcs thrived in the psychically charged environment, their numbers and aggression increasing beyond what the Tyranids could match through biological adaptation alone. The Greenskins began winning the Octarius War, their victories producing a flood of battle-hardened Orcs who were spreading beyond the sector's boundaries in search of new fights. The emergence of these Octarius veterans created problems across multiple fronts. The Orcs who survived the fighting against Tyranids had learned tactics that made them far more dangerous than typical Greenskins. They understood the importance of eliminating synapse creatures to disrupt Tyranid coordination. They had developed weapons specifically designed to penetrate Tyranid bioarmor. Most troublingly, they had grown larger and stronger through constant combat against one of the galaxy's most lethal species, with some specimens approaching the size of the ancient beast-class warbosses that had nearly destroyed the Imperium millennia ago. Imperial forces engaging these Octarius veterans discovered that standard anti-Orc tactics often proved ineffective. The Greenskins fought with discipline that was shocking for their species, maintaining coordinated assaults even when taking casualties that should have broken their morale. The Speedwa led by Speed Boss Kruldaka represented a different manifestation of Orc threat evolution. This massive Greenskin force specialized in rapid mechanized warfare, with its armies built around vast numbers of Orc vehicles modified for maximum speed at the expense of armor or reliability. Kruldaka's forces struck across the Segmentum Obscurus, their attacks characterized by lightning raids that overwhelmed defenders before reinforcements could arrive. The Speedwa targeted Imperial supply lines and communication nodes rather than attempting to hold territory, creating disruption that exceeded the actual military damage the Orcs inflicted. Imperial Guard regiments found themselves unable to maintain defensive lines when Orc vehicles could simply drive around fortified positions, while Space Marine strike forces struggled to bring the highly mobile Greenskins to battle on favorable terms. The Vigilus campaign exemplified the convergence of multiple threats that characterized warfare during the Indomitus Crusade. This hive world sat at the mouth of the Nachmund Gauntlet, the corridor through the Great Rift that Guilliman had identified as critical for maintaining contact between Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. Vigilus controlled access to the Gauntlet's Imperium Sanctus terminus, making it a strategic objective for every hostile force that recognized the corridor's importance. The planet's defensive situation deteriorated rapidly as multiple enemies launched nearly simultaneous attacks, each seeking to claim Vigilus for their own purposes or deny it to the Imperium. Kruldaka's speed struck Vigilus first, with Orc forces pouring through breaches in the planetary defense network that Genestealer cult saboteurs had created. The Greenskins deployed across Vigilus's wastelands in numbers that overwhelmed the PDF forces assigned to patrol these regions. Orc buggies and war trucks raced across the ash wastes, their crude weapons tearing apart Imperial positions before the defenders could call for support. The Speed Waz tactics created chaos that paralyzed Imperial command structures. Reports of Orc attacks came from dozens of locations simultaneously, making it impossible for planetary authorities to determine where to commit their limited reserves. The Greenskins demonstrated uncharacteristic coordination, with different speed mobs timing their attacks to prevent Imperial forces from concentrating against any single thrust. The Genestealer cult presence on Vigilus had been growing for generations before the planet's strategic importance drew external attention. The cults operated through Vigilus's massive hive cities, their members infiltrating every level of planetary society, from the lowest underhive gangs to the highest levels of the administratum bureaucracy. The opening of the Great Rift and the subsequent isolation during the Noctis Aeterna had allowed the cults to expand their influence without inquisitorial interference. By the time Imperial forces recognized the scale of the infestation, cultists controlled entire hive districts and had suborned significant portions of the planetary defense forces. The cult uprising that coincided with the Orc invasion was not a spontaneous rebellion, but a carefully coordinated operation that targeted infrastructure critical to Vigilus's defense. The cultists sabotaged the void shield generators that protected Vigilus's hive cities from orbital bombardment. They destroyed communication hubs that allowed Imperial forces to coordinate their responses to the multiple threats. Cult members embedded in the PDF turned their weapons on loyal units, creating confusion about which forces could be trusted. The most devastating sabotage involved the planet's macro-claw defense batteries, massive weapons systems designed to engage enemy vessels in orbit. Cultist infiltrators disabled these batteries at the moment when the Orc fleet began its assault, leaving Vigilus vulnerable to orbital attack. The coordination required for these simultaneous actions across a planet of billions demonstrated the sophistication that Genestealer cults could achieve when given time to properly infiltrate a target. The arrival of Abaddon, the Despoiler's forces transformed the Vigilus campaign from a defensive action into a battle that would determine control of the Nachmund Gauntlet itself. The Warmaster of Chaos recognized that seizing Vigilus would effectively close the corridor to Imperial use, severing the connection between the two halves of the divided Imperium. Abaddon deployed elements of the Black Legion alongside warbands from other traitor legions and renegade chapters, creating a force that combined the tactical sophistication of Chaos Space Marines with the demonic support that the Warmaster could summon through his connection to the Dark Gods. The Black Legion's assault on Vigilus began with targeted strikes against the planet's remaining orbital defenses, with Chaos warships emerging from the warp at close range to their targets and devastating them before Imperial Navy vessels could respond. The ground campaign on Vigilus developed into a multi-sided conflict where Imperial forces, Orcs, Genestealer cultists, and Chaos Space Marines all fought for control of the planet's strategic locations. The Hive cities became battlegrounds where different factions held different districts, with fighting raging through hab blocks and industrial zones that had housed billions of civilians before the war began. Imperial forces discovered that the urban environment created situations where their technological advantages became less decisive. A squad of Space Marines advancing through narrow corridors faced threats from cultist ambushes, Orc mobs emerging from unexpected directions, and Chaos Space Marine kill teams that used the terrain to negate the Loyalists' superior equipment and training. The defense of Vigilus required Imperial commanders to make decisions about resource allocation that had no good answers. Committing forces to eliminate the Genestealer cult infestation meant weakening the defensive lines against the Orc invasion. Focusing on the Speedwa allowed Chaos forces to establish fortified positions in captured Hive districts. Engaging the Black Legion drew resources away from dealing with the cultists who continued to sabotage Imperial infrastructure. The planetary governor, supported by Space Marine advisors and Astra Militarum generals, attempted to prioritize threats based on their strategic impact, but the fluid nature of the fighting meant that situations changed faster than command could respond. The Adeptus Mechanicus presence on Vigilis added another layer to the campaign's complexity. The planet housed multiple forge complexes that produced equipment for Imperial forces across the sector, making them valuable targets for every hostile force involved in the fighting. The tech priests who controlled these facilities maintained their own defensive forces and pursued their own objectives, which did not always align with the broader Imperial strategy. Some forge complexes continued production even as fighting raged around them, their tech priest overseers unwilling to halt manufacturing schedules without direct orders from Mars. Others fortified their positions and refused to commit their Skitarii forces to support Imperial Guard units fighting nearby, prioritizing the protection of their facilities over the defense of the planet as a whole. The arrival of Imperial reinforcements from the Indomitus Crusade provided Vigilis's defenders with the resources needed to stabilize the situation, though not to achieve outright victory. Fleet elements carrying Primaris Marine reinforcements fought their way through the Chaos blockade, their warships trading fire with Black Legion vessels as they forced passage to the planet's surface. The Primaris Marines deployed directly into combat zones, where Imperial forces faced imminent collapse, their enhanced capabilities and superior equipment providing the edge needed to halt enemy advances. The intercessor squads that formed the core of Primaris infantry proved particularly effective in the urban fighting that characterized much of the Vigilis campaign, their bolt rifles engaging cultists and Chaos Space Marines at ranges where the enemy's weapons became less accurate. The fighting in Vigilis's ash wastes demonstrated the challenges of engaging the Speedwa in terrain that favored their mobility. Imperial armored regiments deployed to intercept Orc vehicle columns found themselves outmaneuvered by greenskins, whose buggies and bikes could traverse terrain that Imperial tanks struggled to cross. The Orcs exploited their speed advantage ruthlessly, hitting Imperial positions and withdrawing before artillery or air support could be brought to bear. Imperial commanders adapted by establishing fortified strong points that the Orcs could not simply bypass, forcing the greenskins to either engage in the kind of sustained combat that negated their mobility advantages or abandon their attacks on specific objectives. The strategy worked in some areas but created its own problems. Imperial forces tied down in static defenses could not respond to Orc attacks elsewhere, allowing the Speedwa to continue its disruption of Imperial operations. The wars of faith that erupted across Imperium Nihilus represented a different category of threat, one that emerged from within the Imperium itself rather than from external enemies. The isolation caused by the Great Rift had severed worlds from contact with the Ecclesiarchy's central authority on Terra, forcing local religious leaders to interpret the Imperial Creed without guidance or oversight. On many worlds, this produced variations in doctrine and practice that remained recognizably within the bounds of Orthodox Emperor worship. On others, the isolation allowed religious movements to develop in directions that the Synod Terra would have immediately condemned as heresy. The most troubling cases involved worlds where divergent interpretations of the Imperial Creed had become so deeply embedded in local culture that populations viewed attempts to enforce Orthodox doctrine as attacks on their faith itself. The world of Gathalammer exemplified the challenges that Imperial forces faced when confronting religious divergence that had not crossed into outright heresy. This cardinal world had maintained its loyalty to the Emperor throughout the isolation, with its population continuing to worship the Master of Mankind with fervor that impressed even hardened ecclesiarchy officials. The problem emerged from how that worship manifested. Gathalammer's religious authorities had developed elaborate rituals that incorporated elements the Ministorum considered inappropriate. the use of psychic phenomena in religious ceremonies, the veneration of local saints who had never received official sanction from Terra, and theological interpretations that emphasized humanity's potential for spiritual evolution rather than submission to the Emperor's will. When Indomitus Crusade forces arrived, and ecclesiarchy officials attempted to correct these deviations, they encountered resistance from a population that viewed their practices as the truest expression of faith in the Emperor. The situation on worlds like Gathalammer forced Imperial commanders to decide whether enforcing religious orthodoxy justified the risk of rebellion or civil war. The ecclesiarchy representatives attached to Crusade fleets argued that allowing heretical practices to continue would undermine the spiritual unity that held the Imperium together, that compromising on doctrine would create precedents that could lead to more serious deviations in the future. Military commanders countered that forcing compliance on worlds that had remained loyal through decades of isolation would alienate populations that the Imperium needed as allies, that religious wars would consume resources better spent fighting external enemies. The resolution of these disputes varied based on the specific circumstances of each world and the personalities of the officials involved, creating an inconsistent approach that satisfied neither the ecclesiarchy's desire for orthodoxy nor the military's preference for pragmatic compromise. The most extreme cases required military intervention to prevent worlds from descending into chaos or falling to actual chaos corruption disguised as religious fervor. Some isolated worlds had developed belief systems that incorporated elements of warp worship alongside Emperor veneration, their populations unable to distinguish between psychic phenomena that served the Emperor and manifestations of the ruinous powers. Inquisitorial investigation of these worlds revealed corruption that had spread too deeply to be eliminated through conventional means. The response ranged from targeted purges of religious leadership to complete exterminatus when the corruption had infected the entire population. Each such action created ripples of resentment among neighboring worlds, populations that wondered whether their own religious practices might be deemed heretical and their worlds subjected to similar treatment. The devastation of Baal and its aftermath represented one of the Indomitus Crusade's most significant operations in terms of both military scale and symbolic importance. The Blood Angels' home world faced assault by Hive Fleet Leviathan, a Tyranid splinter fleet of such magnitude that it threatened to consume Baal and its moons entirely. Commander Dante, the chapter master who had led the Blood Angels for over 1,000 years, coordinated the defense with his successor chapters, the Flesh Terrors, Lamenters, Blood Drinkers, and dozens of other formations created from Sanguinius's gene seed. The combined force represented nearly every Blood Angel's successor in existence, a gathering of the sons of Sanguinius that had not occurred since the Horus Heresy. The scale of the Tyranid assault required this concentration of force, with bioships arriving in numbers that darkened Baal's skies and ground organisms swarming across the planet's rad wastes in waves that seemed endless. The fighting on Baal tested the Blood Angels and their successors in ways that even their long history of warfare had not prepared them for. The Tyranids adapted to the Defenders' tactics with the speed that characterized their species, evolving new organisms to counter specific threats and exploiting weaknesses in the Space Marines' defensive lines. The Blood Angels discovered that their preference for close combat played into the Tyranids' strengths. The aliens thrived in melee engagements where their numbers and biological weapons could overwhelm even enhanced warriors. The chapter's Sanguinary Guard, elite veterans who normally served as shock troops capable of breaking enemy formations, found themselves fighting desperate defensive actions as Tyranid organisms swarmed their positions. The Death Company, Blood Angels who had succumbed to the Black Rage and believed themselves to be Sanguinius fighting at the Siege of Terra, threw themselves at the Tyranid swarms with suicidal fury that killed thousands of aliens but could not stem the tide. The arrival of Guilliman's reinforcements transformed the Baal campaign from a last stand into a victory that preserved the Blood Angels and their successor chapters. The Primarch brought Primaris Marines created from Blood Angels' gene seed, along with fleet elements and conventional Imperial forces that provided the defenders with resources they desperately needed. The Primaris Marines deployed directly into the heaviest fighting, their bolt rifles and plasma weapons cutting down Tyranid organisms at ranges where the aliens' biological weapons became less effective. The relief forces' arrival coincided with a critical moment in the battle. The Tyranids had breached the final defensive lines protecting Baal's fortress monastery, and Dante himself fought at the breach alongside his sanguinary guard. The Primarch's forces hit the Tyranid rear, creating the disruption needed for the Blood Angels to launch a counterattack that drove the aliens back from the fortress walls. The relationship between Dante and Guilliman developed into something more complex than simple commander and subordinate. The chapter master had led the Blood Angels for longer than Guilliman had been in stasis, his experience spanning centuries of warfare that the Primarch had missed entirely. Dante commanded the respect of every Blood Angel successor chapter, his reputation built through countless campaigns and his leadership during the devastation of Baal, cementing his status as the greatest living son of Sanguinius. Guilliman recognized these realities and treated Dante with a deference that surprised observers who expected the Primarch to simply assume direct command. The two warriors developed a working relationship built on mutual respect rather than strict hierarchy, with Guilliman providing strategic direction and resources, while allowing Dante to maintain operational control over Blood Angels' forces and their successors. The integration of Primaris Marines into the Blood Angels and their successor chapters proceeded more smoothly than in many other formations, partly because of Dante's endorsement, but also because of the desperate circumstances that the chapters faced. The losses suffered during the devastation of Baal had reduced some successor chapters to a fraction of their former strength, making reinforcements of any kind welcome regardless of concerns about tradition or the implications of accepting enhanced warriors. The Primaris Marines created from Blood Angels' gene seed demonstrated the same artistic sensibilities and nobility that characterized their chapter, along with what appeared to be genuine resistance to the Red Thirst and Black Rage. The integration created Blood Angels formations that combined veterans who had fought for centuries with enhanced warriors who brought new capabilities, the mixture producing companies that maintained the chapter's traditions while adapting to the tactical possibilities that Primaris equipment provided. The strategic stabilization achieved across Imperium Sanctus by the later years of the Indomitus Crusade represented a fundamental shift in the Imperium's military posture. The initial desperate scramble to respond to threats that had metastasized during the Noctis Aeterna gradually transformed into coordinated campaigns that operated according to coherent strategic plans. The establishment of permanent supply lines connecting Forge worlds to frontline positions allowed Imperial forces to sustain operations that would have been impossible during the chaos immediately following the Great Rift's opening. Naval convoys moved between systems on schedules that approached the reliability of pre-Rift standards, though the warp storms that continued to churn across the galaxy meant that delays and losses remained far more common than they had been in earlier millennia. The Nachmund Gauntlet emerged as the single most critical strategic asset in Imperium Sanctus, its importance exceeding even major Forge worlds or fortress systems. This corridor through the Great Rift provided the only reliable route for moving forces and supplies between the two halves of the divided Imperium. The Gauntlet's establishment required securing a chain of systems along its length, with each world fortified to resist the constant pressure from Chaos forces that sought to close the corridor. The Imperial Navy maintained permanent patrol fleets along the route, their warships escorting convoys and responding to incursions that threatened to cut the passage. The contested nature of the Gauntlet meant that control over individual systems changed hands repeatedly, with Imperial forces launching operations to reclaim lost positions, while Chaos warbands conducted raids aimed at disrupting traffic through the corridor. The military infrastructure supporting the Gauntlet consumed resources on a scale that strained even Imperium Sanctus's industrial capacity. The fortress worlds along the route required constant resupply of ammunition, replacement equipment, and fresh troops to replace casualties from the endless fighting. The naval facilities that serviced convoy escort vessels needed materials for repairs and construction of new ships to replace losses. The Adeptus Mechanicus established forge complexes on several Gauntlet worlds, specifically to support local defensive operations, their manufactorums producing munitions and equipment that would otherwise need to be shipped from distant forge worlds. The investment reflected strategic calculations that recognized the Gauntlet's importance. Losing the corridor would effectively abandon Imperium Nihilus to its fate, transforming half the galaxy into territory that the Imperium could neither defend nor reclaim. The transformation of the Adeptus Astartes through Primaris integration proceeded unevenly across different chapters, but accelerated as the practical advantages of the enhanced warriors became undeniable. Chapters that had initially resisted accepting Primaris reinforcements found their positions becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as they watched other formations achieve victories that their own depleted ranks could not match. The Ultima founding created hundreds of new chapters composed entirely of Primaris Marines, formations that had no connection to the traditions and rivalries that complicated integration efforts among older chapters. These new chapters deployed across both Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, their commanders selected from Primaris Marines who had demonstrated leadership capabilities during training or early combat operations. The organizational structure of Primaris heavy chapters evolved in directions that reflected both Guilliman's preferences and the practical realities of warfare during the Indomitus Crusade. The traditional company organization that the Codex Astartes prescribed remained the foundation, but chapters adapted their internal structures to account for the different capabilities that Primaris Marines and their equipment provided. Intercessor squads became the standard infantry formation, their bolt rifles providing fire support at ranges where standard tactical Marines had historically struggled. Hellblaster squads armed with plasma weapons filled the heavy support role, their ability to eliminate armored targets making them essential for operations against enemies who deployed vehicles or heavily armored infantry. The Inceptor squads with their jump packs and assault weapons brought mobility that allowed Primaris forces to conduct the kind of rapid redeployment that had always been a Space Marine strength. The integration of standard Space Marines with Primaris formations created companies that combined different equipment types and tactical capabilities within single operational units. Veteran sergeants who had crossed the Rubicon Primaris led squads of enhanced warriors, their centuries of experience guiding Marines who possessed superior physical capabilities but lacked the accumulated knowledge that only decades of combat could provide. The mixture produced formations that maintained chapter traditions while adapting to new tactical possibilities. A Blood Angels assault company might include Death Company Marines fighting alongside Primaris assault intercessors, the combination preserving the chapter's preference for close combat while incorporating the enhanced durability and firepower that Primaris equipment provided. The evolution of Space Marine warfare doctrine reflected lessons learned during the Indomitus Crusade's major campaigns. The traditional emphasis on rapid strikes and surgical precision remained central to how Space Marines operated, but chapters increasingly found themselves required to hold territory and conduct sustained operations, rather than simply conducting raids or serving as shock troops for larger Imperial Guard formations. The Primaris Marines' enhanced endurance and the improved logistics that their standardized equipment allowed made extended campaigns more feasible than they had been for standard Space Marine formations. Chapters deployed to contested sectors established forward operating bases that allowed them to maintain pressure on enemy positions over weeks or months rather than conducting brief strikes before withdrawing to resupply. The challenges facing Imperium Nihilus persisted despite the resources that Fleet Tertius and the Torchbearer fleets brought to the region. The isolation from Terra and the absence of the Astronomican's light created conditions where every victory remained temporary and every defeat risked becoming permanent. Imperial forces operating in Imperium Nihilus developed a siege mentality, their commanders understanding that reinforcement from outside the region could not be relied upon and that losses could not be easily replaced. The Sanctus Wall fortification network provided strongpoints that allowed Imperial forces to maintain presence across multiple sectors, but the network's effectiveness depended on the ability to move forces between fortress systems when specific positions came under concentrated attack. The unreliability of warp travel meant that such reinforcement often arrived too late or not at all. The rise of the Pariah Nexus represented a new category of threat that emerged during the later stages of the Indomitus Crusade. This region of space near the Sautek dynasty's territory began exhibiting properties that defied normal understanding of how the warp interacted with real space. Psykers entering the affected zone reported their abilities diminishing or vanishing entirely, while astropaths attempting to send messages through the region found their psychic calls absorbed by a silence that seemed to emanate from the Nexus itself. Investigation by inquisitorial teams and Adeptus Mechanicus explorator fleets revealed Necron involvement, with the ancient xenos deploying pylons similar to those that had once stood on Cadia. The pylons generated a field that suppressed warp phenomena across vast distances, creating a bubble of real space where demonic entities could not manifest and psychic powers became unreliable or impossible to use. The strategic implications of the Pariah Nexus extended beyond its immediate military threat. The Imperium relied on Psykers for interstellar communication, navigation, and various military applications that ranged from battlefield divination to the psychic powers that librarians wielded in combat. A technology that could nullify these capabilities represented an existential threat to Imperial operations across any region where the Necrons deployed it. The Adeptus Mechanicus expressed particular interest in understanding the pylon's function, recognizing that similar technology might provide protection against demonic incursion or allow the Imperium to create zones where chaos influence could be suppressed. The ethical and practical complications of pursuing such technology created debates within the Mechanicus hierarchy. The pylons represented Xenos artifacts whose use might constitute tech heresy, but their potential value in combating chaos made them attractive targets for study and possible replication. The continued advance of Hive Fleet Leviathan and other Tyranid splinter fleets demonstrated that the Great Devourer remained a threat comparable to chaos despite the attention that the Great Rift commanded. The Tyranids adapted to the changed strategic environment with the biological flexibility that made them such dangerous opponents. Hive fleets operating in regions affected by heavy warp presence evolved organisms resistant to demonic corruption, their synaptic networks developing defenses against the psychic assault that chaos entities typically employed. The Tyranids demonstrated no interest in the ideological conflicts that drove other factions. They consumed biomass regardless of whether it came from loyal Imperial worlds, chaos-held territories, or Xeno civilizations. This single-minded focus made them predictable in strategic terms, but no less dangerous for that predictability. The Octarius War's conclusion with Orc victory created a flood of battle-hardened greenskins spreading across neighboring sectors, their numbers and aggression amplified by decades of constant combat against the Tyranids. These Octarius veterans represented a qualitative shift in the Orc threat, their experience and size making them far more dangerous than typical greenskins. Imperial forces engaging these enhanced Orcs discovered that standard anti-greenskin tactics often proved inadequate. The Orcs fought with discipline that was shocking for their species, maintaining coordinated assaults and demonstrating tactical flexibility that suggested the presence of unusually cunning warbosses. The Indomitus Crusade devoted significant resources to containing the Octarius veterans, recognizing that allowing them to spread unchecked could create wars that rivaled the legendary beast in scale and threat. Guilliman's ongoing reforms of Imperial institutions proceeded against resistance that ranged from passive bureaucratic obstruction to to active opposition from factions that viewed the Primarch's changes as threats to their authority. The Administratum's Baroque complexity had developed over 10 millennia, creating systems where inefficiency had become embedded in the structure itself. The Primarch's attempts to streamline administrative processes and eliminate redundant bureaucracy encountered officials who had spent their entire careers mastering the existing system and who viewed simplification as an attack on their expertise. The reforms proceeded slowly, implemented in regions where Guilliman's authority was unquestioned, while stalling in areas where local officials could claim that unique circumstances required maintaining traditional practices. The Primarch's relationship with the ecclesiarchy remained fraught with tension that neither side could fully resolve. Guilliman rejected the Emperor's divinity, viewing his father as the greatest human who had ever lived, but fundamentally still human, rather than a god worthy of worship. The ecclesiarchy's entire structure and the faith of trillions of imperial citizens rested on the opposite belief that the Emperor was divine, that worship was the appropriate response to his majesty, and that the imperial creed provided spiritual truth rather than political convenience. The Primarch could not publicly challenge these beliefs without risking civil war across worlds where faith in the Emperor's divinity was the only thing maintaining social order. He settled for attempting to moderate the ecclesiarchy's more extreme practices, arguing against the waste of resources on elaborate religious ceremonies when those resources could support military operations or improve civilian living conditions. The High Lords of Terra viewed Guilliman with a mixture of relief at his leadership during the crisis and concern about the precedent his authority established. The Primarch operated with powers that exceeded what any individual had wielded since the Emperor's confinement to the Golden Throne. He issued orders that superseded the High Lord's authority, reorganized military command structures without consulting the Council, and made strategic decisions that committed resources across multiple sectors. The High Lords recognized that the Imperium's survival during the immediate crisis had depended on this concentration of authority, that the fragmented decision-making process that normally characterized imperial governance could not respond quickly enough to the threats that emerged after the Great Rift's opening. But they also understood that allowing such concentration of power to persist indefinitely created risks of its own. What would happen when Guilliman's strategic priorities conflicted with the High Lord's assessment of the Imperium's needs? The Primarch's vision for humanity's future balanced pragmatism, born from his experience during the Great Crusade with recognition of the realities that 10,000 years had created. Guilliman understood that the Imperium he had helped build was gone, transformed into something that combined the worst aspects of theocracy, bureaucratic paralysis, and military desperation. He could not restore the imperial truth or return to the secular rationalism that had characterized the early Imperium. Too many people across too many worlds drew meaning and purpose from their faith in the Emperor's divinity. The Primarch focused instead on practical improvements that might allow the Imperium to survive the increasingly hostile galaxy it faced. Better coordination between different branches of the imperial military, more efficient allocation of resources based on strategic priorities rather than bureaucratic inertia, elimination of the most egregious corruption and incompetence that plagued imperial governance at every level. The establishment of the Unnumbered Sons as a permanent formation represented one of Guilliman's most significant organizational innovations. These companies of Primaris Marines drawn from multiple chapters operated under direct Primarch authority, deploying to war zones where their mixed chapter composition and enhanced capabilities made them ideal for missions that required both flexibility and overwhelming force. The Unnumbered Sons served as a strategic reserve that Guilliman could commit to critical battles without needing to negotiate with individual chapter masters or wait for forces to be assembled from scattered formations. The existence of Space Marines who answered to the Primarch rather than their chapters created tensions, with some chapter masters who viewed it as undermining the autonomy that chapters had maintained since the second founding. But the practical value of having such a force available outweighed these concerns. The long-term implications of the Era Indomitus extended beyond the immediate military victories or territorial gains that the Crusade achieved. The Imperium that emerged from the crisis was fundamentally different from what had existed before the Great Rift's opening. The integration of Primaris Marines had created an Adeptus Astartes that combined traditional formations with enhanced warriors, the mixture producing chapters that maintained their identities while adapting to new capabilities. The establishment of the Nachmund Gauntlet and the Sanctus Wall provided strategic infrastructure that would shape Imperial military operations for generations. The reforms that Guilliman implemented, however incomplete or compromised by resistance, introduced changes to Imperial governance that could not be easily reversed even if the Primarch's authority eventually diminished. The galaxy that the Imperium faced in the wake of the Indomitus Crusade remained hostile in ways that exceeded even the Dark Millennium that had preceded the Great Rift. Chaos forces controlled territory across both sides of the cicatrix maledictum, their demon worlds and corrupted systems serving as staging areas for invasions that the Imperium struggled to contain. The Tyrannid hive fleets continued their advance, consuming worlds and adapting to every defense that Imperial forces deployed against them. The Necrons awakened in increasing numbers, their ancient technology and immortal warriors pursuing objectives that ranged from reclaiming their former empire to eliminating all organic life from the galaxy. The Orcs thrived in the chaos, their was growing larger and more dangerous as the psychic turbulence from the Great Rift energized their species. Yet the Imperium endured. The Space Marines, who had received Primaris reinforcements or crossed the Rubicon themselves, continued their eternal war against humanity's enemies. The Imperial Guard regiments deployed across thousands of worlds held defensive lines and launched offensives with the same grim determination that had characterized the Astra Militarum for 10 millennia. The forge worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus maintained production of the weapons and equipment that Imperial forces required, their tech priests pursuing the Omnissiahs will through manufacture and maintenance of the Imperium's war machine. The common citizens of the Imperium, the billions who labored in manufactorums, tended crops on agri-worlds, or simply struggled to survive in the underhives of countless worlds, continued their existence, their faith in the Emperor, and their acceptance of suffering providing the foundation upon which the entire imperial structure rested. Guilliman's assessment of the Imperium's prospects combined the strategic realism that had made him one of the Emperor's most valued sons with an understanding of human nature that 10,000 years in stasis had not diminished. The Primarch recognized that the Imperium could not achieve final victory against the threats arrayed against it. The galaxy was too large, the enemies too numerous and too varied, and the Imperium's resources too limited for any hope of ultimate triumph. The goal was survival, the preservation of humanity as a species, and the Imperium as a civilization, despite everything that sought to destroy both. It was a grim vision, one that offered no hope of peace or prosperity, only the promise of continued existence purchased through eternal vigilance and sacrifice. But it was a vision grounded in the reality of the galaxy, as it existed rather than the dreams of what it might have been, and perhaps that pragmatic acceptance of limitation represented the greatest wisdom that the Era Indomitus could offer to the Imperium's future.